The morning Nathan Reed's life changed forever. It started with the sound of heavy chains. He stepped onto his porch at 6 a.m., coffee mug in hand, still half asleep, and stopped cold. 12 vehicles. Rusted, crushed, leaking fluid onto his driveway like wounded animals dragged there to die. A tow truck was already pulling away. No explanation. No note. His neighbor across the street stood on her lawn with her phone raised, already filming. Nathan didn't move, didn't shout, just stood there in his bare feet on the cold concrete looking at the wreckage Victoria Sinclair had left him. But before we get into this story, if you stay until the end, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and let's get into it. Nathan Reed was the kind of man people forgot about the moment they walked past him. Not because he was unpleasant, not because he was strange, but because he had, over the years, perfected the quiet art of existing without drawing attention. He drove a dented 2009 F-150 that he maintained himself. He wore the same style of gray or navy work shirt almost every day. He nodded to neighbors, held doors open at the gas station, and never once raised his voice at anyone in public. Not because he was timid, but because he had learned early in life that the people who shouted the loudest were usually the ones with the least control. He lived in a cream-colored house on the corner of Alderman Street and Route 9, just outside the main town limits of Calverton, Ohio. The house sat on 3/4 of an acre, which was more land than most people his age in Calverton could dream of owning. He'd bought it 6 years ago from an elderly couple named the Hallerans, who had loved the place for 30 years and wanted it to go to someone who would love it back. Nathan had paid every cent in cash. Nobody in Calverton knew where the cash came from. Most assumed he'd inherited it. Some assumed he'd gotten lucky in a legal settlement after a workplace accident. There was a rumor circulating at the Sunoco station on 5th that he'd lost a finger and won $100,000 over it, which wasn't true, but Nathan never bothered to correct it. The house had a wide front porch, a 2-car garage that Nathan had expanded to 3 bays using reclaimed lumber and his own hands, and a backyard with a tire swing hanging from an old oak tree. The tire swing was for his daughter, Lily, who was 7 years old, missing one front tooth, and currently the only person in Nathan's life who could make him laugh without trying. Lily had her mother's dark eyes and her mother's tendency to talk too fast when she was excited about something. She collected smooth river rocks and kept them in a shoebox under her bed. She could name every dinosaur that had ever appeared in a museum in Ohio because she'd done research, actual, self-directed 7-year-old research, using library books and a tablet with a cracked screen that Nathan kept meaning to replace. Her mother, Diane, had left 3 years ago. Not dramatically, not in a fight. She had simply packed 2 suitcases on a Tuesday morning while Lily was at school and Nathan was at work, and left a note on the kitchen counter that read, "I'm sorry. I'm not who you need me to be. Please don't make Lily hate me." Nathan had read the note twice, folded it, and put it in a drawer. He hadn't cried about it for 6 weeks. And then one night, after Lily was asleep, he sat in the garage with a beer he didn't finish and cried for about 40 minutes, and then he was done. He didn't go looking for Diane. He didn't hire a lawyer to punish her. He contacted a mediator, arranged a child support agreement she could actually maintain on her income as a nursing assistant, and went back to raising his daughter. People in Calverton said Nathan was cold for that, said he had no feelings. Nathan thought those people had never actually tried to keep a 7-year-old's world from falling apart with both hands. He worked as a mechanic at Decker's Auto on Maple, which was a medium-sized shop with 4 bays, a decent reputation, and a sometimes difficult owner named Roy Decker, who could diagnose an engine problem by sound alone and had the interpersonal skills of a wet cat. Nathan had worked there for 4 years. He was the best mechanic Roy had ever employed, and Roy showed his appreciation primarily by giving Nathan the most complex jobs and paying him $11 above shop rate, which, in Roy's world, was practically a love letter. What Roy didn't know, what almost nobody in Calverton knew, was that Decker's Auto was not where Nathan's real mechanical skill lived. That lived in his garage at home. The 3-bay garage on Alderman Street contained, depending on the week, anywhere between 2 and 6 vehicles in various stages of repair or restoration. Nathan had been doing this since he was 16 years old, when his uncle Curtis had handed him a completely seized 1971 Chevelle and said, "Figure it out." It had taken Nathan 8 months. When he finally drove that Chevelle down the street for the first time, his uncle had cried, and Nathan had understood something about himself that he'd never quite been able to explain to anyone. He didn't just understand machines, he felt them. The way a musician might hear a chord and know immediately what was off, Nathan could put his hands on a vehicle and know, not guess, know, what was wrong with it and what it could become. He had turned this skill into money over the years, quietly, without advertising it. Word passed among collectors and dealers, not the showy ones, the real ones, that there was a guy in Calverton, Ohio who could bring a dead car back to life and charge you a fair price to do it. Nathan had never had a website, never posted on social media. The work came to him, and he took what he wanted and declined what he didn't. By the time he was 32, Nathan Reed was worth more than anyone in Calverton would have believed. But he didn't live like it, and he didn't talk about it, and the life he built around his daughter was structured specifically to keep them both in a place that felt real, which was why, when Victoria Sinclair's people had approached him about selling the Alderman Street property 8 weeks ago, Nathan had listened politely, thought about it for less than a minute, and said no. Victoria Sinclair was not from Calverton. She was from Cincinnati, originally, raised in a household where her father had run a mid-sized car dealership and run it well. She had watched him build his business with a focused, almost surgical attention, and she had absorbed everything, the margins, the leverage, the way a well-timed negotiation could shift a deal entirely. When she was 19, her father had given her a small stake in the dealership as a birthday gift. By the time she was 24, she had turned that stake into a controlling interest in 4 additional dealerships across Ohio and Kentucky. She was 30 years old now. Sinclair Automotive Group had 12 dealerships, 2 regional service networks, a fleet management division that handled contracts with 3 county governments, and a development arm, Sinclair Properties, that had been quietly acquiring land across 7 Ohio counties for the past 2 years. Victoria was, depending on who you asked, either a visionary or a predator. Her employees, by and large, feared and respected her in about equal measure. Her competitors, the ones who hadn't yet been absorbed or driven out, had a different word for her that they mostly kept to themselves. She was not cruel for the pleasure of it. That was important to understand. She was calculating. She identified obstacles and she removed them, and she did this with the clean efficiency of someone who had simply never been allowed to believe that other people's feelings were an operational consideration. The Alderman Street property had come onto her radar through the Calverton Development Project, a mixed-use expansion she'd been planning for 14 months that would add a service center, a premium dealership, and what her development team was calling a mobility hub, which was a glass and steel building that would look very impressive in promotional materials. The project required several adjacent parcels. Most of the owners had sold. Nathan Reed had not. Victoria had sent her acquisition manager, a careful man named Dennis Holt, to speak with Nathan twice. Dennis had come back both times with the same report. The man was polite, he was clear, and he was not interested. The second time, Nathan had apparently offered Dennis a cup of coffee and explained without particular emotion that his daughter had learned to walk in that house, and that no development project was worth more than that. Victoria had read Dennis's report with the same expression she used to read quarterly earnings statements. Then she had made a phone call. "I need something handled," she said. "Legally, but I need it to sting." The something that got handled arrived at 5:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning, delivered by 3 flatbed tow trucks contracted through a shell service company 2 counties over. 12 vehicles, all junk, all carefully selected to look as bad as possible, so cracked windshields, missing doors, engine blocks seized with rust, one that appeared to have been partially on fire at some point in its past. They were arranged across Nathan's driveway and the first 8 feet of his front lawn with a precision that suggested someone had planned the layout. Victoria's legal team had been meticulous. The vehicles were registered under names that connected back to Nathan through a series of old parts purchases and consignment agreements that, on paper, looked like Nathan had accepted ownership of them. It wasn't airtight, it wouldn't hold up in a real legal challenge. But it didn't need to. It needed to hold up long enough for the city to issue violations, for neighbors to complain, for local media to take pictures, and for Nathan Reed to look overwhelmed and embarrassed and ready to sell. That was the plan. The sun had barely cleared the tree line when Nathan heard the last tow truck leave. He stood on his porch. His coffee was still hot. He had not moved for several minutes. From across the street, His neighbor Carol Bassett was filming with her phone. She didn't try to hide it. She was 61 years old, had lived on Alderman Street for 22 years, and had never particularly warmed to Nathan because he didn't attend the neighborhood association meetings she organized. She lowered the phone when she saw him looking at her. "You gonna call somebody?" she called out. Nathan looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the cars. "I'll figure it out," he said. He stepped off the porch in his socks. He'd forgotten to put shoes on. Walked to the nearest vehicle, which appeared to be the remains of a 1990s-era Buick Century, and began to look at it. Not stare at it in distress. Look at it. The way a carpenter looks at a warped board, measuring, calculating, already thinking 3 steps ahead. Carol watched him for about 30 seconds, didn't get the reaction she was looking for, and went inside. By the time Lily came downstairs at 7:15, Nathan had walked every car and was back in the kitchen making scrambled eggs and toast. "Dad," Lily said, standing at the kitchen window, "there are cars in our yard." "I know. Like, a lot of cars." 12. She turned from the window. She was in her dinosaur pajamas, the ones with the pterodactyls on them. Her hair was going in 4 different directions. "Did you buy them?" "Someone left them." She thought about that. "That's weird." "It is," Nathan agreed. He slid the eggs onto a plate and set it in front of her. "Eat your breakfast. You've got school. Are you in trouble?" He looked at her. She was watching him with those dark eyes, very still, the way she got when she was trying to read the situation. "No," he said. Not a reassurance, just a fact. "I'm not in trouble." She held his gaze for another second, then picked up her fork. The city moved faster than Nathan expected. He'd give them that. By 10 a.m., he had a voicemail from a code compliance officer named Gerald Fitch, informing him that he had received a formal complaint about abandoned vehicles on residential property, and that under Calverton Municipal Code Section 14-227, he was required to remove or address the situation within 72 hours or face a fine of $250 per vehicle per day. Nathan called back and got Fitch's voicemail. He left a calm, clear message explaining that the vehicles had been placed on his property without his consent, that he was in the process of documenting this, and that he would appreciate a call back to discuss the matter before any fines were assessed. Fitch did not call back. At 4 p.m., Nathan received the formal written notice by email. 12 vehicles, 72 hours, $250 each per day. Nathan did the math. If the city actually followed through, and he suspected they would, given the political pressure likely being applied from Sinclair's direction, he was looking at $3,000 a day if he didn't act. He sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and a yellow legal pad and spent 2 hours going through the paperwork trail on the vehicles. He was looking for what he expected to find, the paper chain that Sinclair's team had constructed. It took him a while to trace it because it had been done carefully, but it was there. And it had 2 weaknesses he noted and set aside. Then he switched directions entirely. He pulled up the vehicle identification numbers on each of the 12 cars and started running them. This was the part of the story that nobody watching from the outside would ever fully understand. Nathan Reed had been buying, selling, and restoring vehicles for 16 years. In that time, he had developed a system, not written down anywhere, not shared with anyone, for evaluating any vehicle at a distance. He could look at a car the way a jeweler looks at an uncut stone, not at what it was, but at what it contained. He worked through the VINs one by one. Most came back as he expected, damaged beyond the point where most buyers would find value. A 1997 Honda Accord with catastrophic frame damage. A 2003 Ford Ranger with a destroyed transmission and evidence of a flood. A mid-2000s Dodge minivan that had the specific sadness of a vehicle that had once carried children and was now crushed along one entire side. But as he worked through the list, he began to slow down. Vehicle 6 stopped him, then Vehicle 9, and then Vehicle 11. And when he pulled up the information on Vehicle 11, he read it twice, very carefully, and then he set down his pen. He sat back in his chair. From down the hall came the sound of Lily's tablet, playing whatever dinosaur documentary she'd found on YouTube. Nathan looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he smiled. It was a small smile, not triumphant, almost private, like something had just confirmed itself. He picked up his pen and wrote 3 words on the legal pad. She didn't look. Vehicle 11 was a 1969 Ford Mustang Boss 429. If that means nothing to you, here's what it means to someone like Nathan Reed, the boss. 429 was built for 1 season. Ford produced fewer than 860 of them in 1969. They were created to homologate the 429 cubic inch engine for NASCAR, which meant Ford needed to install them in street-legal cars, so they did, briefly, and then they stopped. The result was a vehicle that felt like someone had poured a race engine into a street car's body and then wondered why it vibrated differently than anything else on the road. In reasonable condition, a verified Boss 429 in the current collector market sold for between $200,000 and $400,000. Vehicle 11 was not in reasonable condition. Its exterior panels were so corroded that the metal had puckered and cracked in places. Both doors were stuck. The windshield was gone. The engine bay was buried under 16 years of accumulated debris, bird nesting material, and what appeared to be a family of deceased mice. But the VIN confirmed it, and Nathan's hands confirmed it. When he walked back out to the driveway after Lily was in bed and crouched next to the chassis rail in the cold dark with a flashlight, he could see what nobody else had bothered to look for: the original stampings, uncorrupted, in the right places. Victoria Sinclair had buried a museum piece in her junk pile. He turned off the flashlight and stayed in a crouch for a moment in the cold, thinking. The thing about people who had always had money, Nathan had learned, was that they often had no real understanding of specific value. They understood categories: old car, new car, expensive car, cheap car. They didn't understand the layers beneath. They paid people to understand the layers. And often those people were adequate but not exceptional, and they missed things. Someone on Victoria's team had looked at 12 damaged vehicles and seen 12 damaged vehicles. Nathan had looked at 12 damaged vehicles and found one that could change the entire shape of his life. He stood up, went inside, washed the grease off his hands, and went to bed. The next morning at work, Roy Decker asked Nathan what was going on. Roy was 54, built like a furnace, with hands that looked like they had been designed for a slightly larger human being. He'd heard about the cars from 3 different people before Nathan even arrived at the shop. "That Sinclair woman did that?" Roy asked. He was standing in the doorway of his office, which was a room that contained approximately 11,000 pieces of paper and 1 functioning chair. "She actually had somebody dump a bunch of cars on your lawn?" "Looks that way." "That's insane. That's something a cartoon villain does." Nathan opened his toolbox. "It happens." "You gonna sue her?" "Maybe." Roy watched him for a moment. "Nathan, seriously, what are you gonna do?" Nathan looked up at him. "I'm gonna fix them," he said. Roy stared. "Fix the junk cars she left on your lawn to harass you?" "Most of them, yeah." "That's—" Roy started to say something, stopped, started again. "I don't know if that's the smartest thing I've ever heard, or the dumbest." "Probably depends on what's inside them," Nathan said, and turned back to his work. Roy stood there for another few seconds, decided he didn't have enough information to have an opinion, and went back to his office. Nathan did not spend the 72 hours panicking. He spent them working. The first thing he did was contact a towing attorney named Sylvia Park, who worked out of a small practice in Canton and had built a reputation on property rights cases. He'd found her 3 years ago during a dispute with a neighboring landowner over a fence line and had liked the way she thought: practical, patient, willing to play the long game. He explained the situation to Sylvia over the phone. She was quiet while he talked. When he finished, she said, "Send me everything you have, Zoom. The paperwork trail, the VINs, the timeline, the voicemails, all of it. Already compiling it." "This isn't airtight from their side," she said. "The ownership chain is thin, but I need to see it. I know it's thin. I don't necessarily want to fight it in court right now. I want to slow it down." Another pause. "Why slow it down?" "Because I need time with the vehicles." "Nathan," Sylvia said, and her voice shifted slightly, "are you planning to actually work on these cars?" "Yes." A short silence, then, "Okay. I'll file for an emergency administrative review of the compliance notice. It won't stop the fines permanently, but it should buy you at least 2 weeks before any enforcement action." "That's enough." He hung up and went to the garage. The second thing Nathan did was make 2 calls to people in his network, people he had never introduced to anyone in Calverton, people who existed entirely in the world of rare and specialty vehicles. The first was a man named Harlan Cross in Pittsburgh, who dealt in pre-1975 American muscle cars and had never once in 20 years offered less than fair market value for anything Nathan brought him. The second was a woman named Inez Correa in Columbus, who specialized in parts and restoration consultation and had more knowledge of Ford's early performance history than anyone Nathan had ever met. To Harlan, he said, "I have something that's going to need your full attention. It's not ready yet, but I'll need you to be available on short notice." Harlan said, "How short?" 90 days, maybe. "That I can do. What is it?" "I'll tell you when I'm sure, but if I'm right, you'll want to clear your schedule." To Inez, Nathan explained what he'd found under the rust on Vehicle 11 and asked 3 specific technical questions about VIN verification on Boss 4, 2 9s produced in the final months of the 1969 model run. Inez answered all 3 questions, then was quiet for a moment. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "Someone left it in my driveway." "Nathan, I know. Do you understand what you're potentially looking at?" "Yes. Don't let anyone else touch it until you've done the full assessment." Already planning on it, he hung up and looked at the 11 other vehicles lined up along his driveway in the early morning light. 11 other problems. Some of them were straightforward, parts cars, worth a few hundred to maybe 1,000 each if he stripped them carefully and sold the components through the right channels. But 2 of the others had caught his attention during his initial VOEN research, and he wanted to look at them more carefully. Vehicle 6 was a 2001 BMW M3 that had suffered severe cosmetic damage, but whose drivetrain, Nathan suspected, was largely intact. In proper running condition, a clean E46 M3 was currently selling between $30,000 and $60,000, depending on mileage and condition. Vehicle 9 was more interesting, a 1985 Porsche 944 Turbo with a crushed rear quarter panel and a seized engine. Rare, and currently enjoying a significant uptick in collector value as the generation that had grown up watching them on posters reached middle age and started spending their money on nostalgia. With the right work, Nathan was looking at somewhere between $20,000 and $40,000. He stood in his driveway in the quiet of a Thursday morning with the sun coming up over the roof of Carol Bassett's house across the street and did math in his head. Even in conservative estimates, even pricing everything low, accounting for his time and parts costs, setting aside Vehicle 11 entirely, what Victoria Sinclair had left in his driveway was worth somewhere between $60,000 and $90,000 when properly processed. If Vehicle 11 was what he thought it was, that number changed so dramatically that it stopped being math and started being something else. He put on his work gloves and got started. By the end of the first week, Alderman Street had developed an opinion. Carol Bassett's video had been shared on the Calverton Community Facebook page, which had 2,400 members and a moderator named Phyllis, who posted a lot about stray cats. The video got 47 comments in the first hour, most of them expressing sympathy for Victoria Sinclair's position and describing Nathan as foolish for not simply taking whatever offer she'd made him. "Some people don't know when to fold," wrote a man named Dave K., who had, according to his profile, never lived within 40 miles of Calverton. "Billionaires don't play games you can win," wrote someone else. "Guys should just take the money and move." Nathan's neighbor to the north, a retired teacher named Herb Makowicz, came over on Friday afternoon to check in. Herb was 70 years old, moved carefully on a bad hip, and had known Nathan for the full 6 years he'd lived on Alderman Street. He was not a man who offered comfort easily, which meant that when he did, it registered. He stood at the edge of Nathan's driveway and looked at the cars. "They're saying downtown that Sinclair set this up," Herb said. "Probably did," Nathan said. He was on his back under the M3 with a light, not looking up. "City's going to fine you. Sylvia Park is handling it." Herb knew Sylvia. He nodded, which Nathan couldn't see. "What are you doing under there?" "Checking the subframe." "And?" Nathan slid out from under the car. He had grease on his jaw and both forearms. He sat up and looked at Herb. "It's good," he said. "Subframe's clean. Engine's going to need work, but the bones are solid." Herb looked at him for a long moment. "You're going to fix them." "Some of them." Herb was quiet, the way old men get when they've lived long enough to recognize something without being able to name it. "You know what you're doing, Nathan?" Nathan looked at the line of cars. "Yeah," he said. "I do." Herb nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, and went back inside. 2 days later, Carol Bassett posted a follow-up video showing Nathan working in his garage at 11 p.m. with the lights on. The caption read, "Stubborn man won't give up. What a waste." It got 63 comments. Nathan didn't have a Facebook account, so he didn't see it. 22 days after the cars arrived, Nathan sold his first vehicle. It was the Porsche, the 944 Turbo. He had spent 11 evenings on it after Lily was in bed, working methodically. The seized engine freed, cleaned, and rebuilt from the crank-up. The rear quarter panel pulled, straightened, filled, and refinished in the original Guards red. The interior stripped, cleaned, and partially retrimmed with period-correct material he sourced from a specialist in Stuttgart he'd worked with twice before. The buyer was a 48-year-old software engineer from Cleveland named Paul Whitmore, who had been looking for a clean 944 Turbo for 3 years and had nearly given up on finding one in this condition. He drove down on a Saturday morning with a trailer and a cashier's check. He walked around the car 3 times without saying anything. Nathan stood by the garage door with his coffee and let him look. "You restore this yourself?" Paul finally asked. "Yes." "Where'd you get it?" "Someone left it in my yard." Paul looked up. "Seriously?" "Seriously." Paul looked at the car again. "How much time did you put in?" "About 60 hours. Paul nodded slowly. Then he said, "I'll give you 38. Nathan had been expecting to ask 32. "38 is fine," he said. Paul wrote the check. Nathan folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. Paul loaded the Porsche onto his trailer with the careful reverence of a man accepting custody of something precious. When he was done, he shook Nathan's hand and said, "If you ever find another one, you call me first." "I will," Nathan said. He went inside. He put the check on the kitchen table and sat down and looked at it. Lily came in from the backyard where she'd been reading and saw the check. She read the number on it with the slow deliberateness of a 7-year-old parsing a larger number than she'd ever seen on paper. "Dad," she said, "is that ours?" "Yes." She looked at it again. "For one of the junky cars?" "One of them." She looked up. "How many more do we have?" Nathan counted in his head, excluding vehicle 11, which was not for sale, not yet, not in its current state, not until every step of the process was done correctly. 10 more. Lily looked back at the check. Then she looked at her father with those dark, assessing eyes. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked. It was the question she'd been carrying for 3 years, Nathan knew. Since the Tuesday morning when she'd come home from school and her mother was gone. She'd never asked it directly before. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "Yeah, baby," he said. "We're going to be more than okay." She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once, the way she did when she'd decided to believe something. She went back to the backyard with her book. Nathan sat at the table a while longer, alone with the check and the particular weight of a promise he intended to keep. 3 weeks after the cars arrived, Victoria Sinclair received her first status report on the Calverton situation. She was in a board meeting when Dennis Holt sent her a text. "Reed hasn't moved, compliance filed, media pickup was minimal, recommend escalation." She stepped out of the meeting for 4 minutes, made 2 calls, and went back in. The escalation took 3 forms. The first was a licensing complaint filed through a third-party legal firm to the Ohio Bureau of Motor Vehicles, alleging that Nathan Reed was conducting a commercial automotive operation from a residential property without the proper dealer or rebuilder license. This was, technically, a genuine regulatory question, and it was designed to create exactly the kind of paperwork burden and operational uncertainty that tended to make people lose their nerve. The second was a call placed to Roy Decker at Decker's Auto by a man who identified himself as a commercial fleet manager interested in a major service contract. Roy spent 45 minutes on the phone with this person before realizing the conversation was going nowhere and hanging up. He mentioned it to Nathan that afternoon, more puzzled than alarmed. "Wasted my whole morning," Roy said. Nathan looked up from the brake job he was doing. "What did he want?" "I don't know. Just talked." Asked a lot of questions about the shop. About you. Nathan set down his wrench. About me specifically? Yeah, your experience, your certifications, how long you'd been here. Roy crossed his arms. What's going on, Nathan? Someone's trying to make things complicated for me. Roy stared at him. Someone being Sinclair? Probably. Roy uncrossed his arms and picked up a rag from the workbench and put it down again, which was what he did when he was thinking. Is she going to come after the shop? No, Nathan said. He said it with a certainty that Roy found, for reasons he couldn't articulate, completely credible. She's not after the shop, she's after me. Same thing from where I'm standing. Not really. Nathan picked his wrench back up. Roy, do you trust me? Roy looked at him for a long time. They had worked together for 4 years. In that time, Roy had seen Nathan diagnose problems that had stumped 2 other mechanics, stay late without being asked, and never once tell a customer something was wrong with their car if it wasn't. Yeah, Roy said. I trust you. Then let me handle it. Roy picked up the rag again, thought better of it, and walked away. The third escalation, and the one that actually made Nathan stop and think, came 2 weeks later in the form of a certified letter from the Calverton City Planning Commission informing him that his property at the corner of Alderman Street and Route 9 had been formally designated for eminent domain consideration under the city's Economic Development Expansion Authority. Nathan read the letter twice. Eminent domain. They were going to try to take the property, not buy it, take it. He called Sylvia. I saw it, she said. Her voice was controlled, but there was something tight in it. This is more aggressive than I expected. Can they do it? Technically, yes. The statute gives them authority for economic development projects that meet certain criteria. The question is whether this project actually meets those criteria, or whether the designation was engineered to pressure you. It was engineered. I believe you, but I need to prove it. I need access to the Planning Commission's deliberations, meeting minutes, communications, the timeline of the designation. She paused. I'm going to file for a temporary restraining order. It won't hold permanently, but it will slow the process down, and I'm going to start digging into the relationships between the Planning Commission and Sinclair Properties. How long do you need? 3 months, minimum. Nathan looked at the calendar on the wall. 3 months. He looked at the garage where Vehicle 11 sat under a canvas tarp, at a stage of restoration that was precisely where he needed it to be. 3 months works, he said. What happened over the next 90 days, if you told it from the outside looking in, looked like a man very slowly losing a fight. The licensing complaint created real problems. Nathan had to document every transaction from the past 3 years, prove that his restoration work qualified under the hobbyist exemption rather than commercial operation, and respond to 2 formal requests for information from state regulators. He hired a business attorney named Frank Galliano, in addition to Sylvia, which cost money. The eminent domain designation generated local news coverage, and almost all of it framed Nathan as an obstacle to economic progress. There was an editorial in the Calverton Courier that described the development project as a generational opportunity for the city, and noted, without much subtlety, that one holdout was slowing the process. Nathan didn't respond to interview requests. This was reported as evidence of his stubbornness. His legal costs were significant. By the end of month 2, he had spent just under $40,000 on attorneys. But here is what the outside view missed. In those same 90 days, Nathan sold 4 more vehicles from the original 12. The M3 went to a dealer in Columbus who specialized in European sports cars. After the subframe work and a full engine refresh, it came back clean and sold for $44,000. A 1990 Land Cruiser that had appeared to be nothing more than a parts hulk turned out to have a rust-free frame under its destroyed body, a combination that made it enormously valuable to the community of FJ80 series enthusiasts who would, Nathan knew from experience, pay serious money for a solid base to build from. He sold it, as is, for $11,000. A 1974 Dodge D100 pickup that was missing its entire front clip sold to a restoration shop in Tennessee for $8,000. They were going to turn it into a show truck. Nathan didn't care what they did with it. He cared about the $8,000. A seized 2005 Subaru WRXSTI which someone had apparently attempted to convert to a track car and then abandoned, was the most labor-intensive of the four, 3 weeks of evenings. But it went to a young man from Akron for $29,000. The young man had been saving for 2 years. He loaded it onto a trailer at 7 a.m. on a Saturday morning, barely slept the night before, and his hands were shaking slightly when he wrote the check. Nathan watched him drive away and felt something that was hard to name. Not quite satisfaction, not quite something larger, somewhere between the two. After parts costs and attorney fees, Nathan's net position after 90 days was just over $90,000 better than it had been the morning the cars arrived, and Vehicle 11 was ready. Nathan called Harlan Cross on a Wednesday evening in late October. Lily was asleep. The garage was quiet. Vehicle 11 was under the canvas tarp, fully restored. Nathan had taken photographs, had the VIN independently verified by 2 separate sources, had a full documentation package prepared, and had spent 2 evenings doing nothing but reading the current collector market for 1969 Boss 429s. "It's ready," he told Harlan. Harlan was quiet for a moment. "Send me the photos." Nathan sent them while Harlan was on the phone. He heard Harlan open the files, heard him go very quiet. "Nathan," Harlan said. "Yeah." "How did you—" Harlan started, stopped, started again. "This was in the junk pile she dropped on your lawn." "Yes." "She didn't—" "No, she didn't know what it was." Harlan made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something more complex. "I have 2 buyers right now who would pay anything to own this car. Anything." "What are we talking about?" "Firm, today I can get you $350 if we let it go to a quiet auction among serious buyers." "No auction," Nathan said. "I want it clean and quick." $350, Harlan said again. "Firm. I'll have the wire sent within 72 hours of inspection." $350,000. Nathan sat in his garage in the dark and looked at the canvas-covered shape of Vehicle 11. "Set up the inspection," he said. 3 days after the Mustang left on Harlan's enclosed trailer, wheels barely touching the ramps as it went, Harlan himself riding shotgun in the truck instead of delegating, which told Nathan everything he needed to know about the car's significance. The wire transfer arrived in Nathan's account. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at the number on his laptop screen for a long time. Then he made a list, not a wish list, an actual list written on the yellow legal pad, in order of priority. 1. Legal, finish the eminent domain fight. Don't settle. Win. 2. Property, secure the house. 3. Lily, college fund now full contribution. 4. Next step. He looked at the 4th item for a while. It was vague on purpose. He'd been thinking about what came after this, after the legal fight, after the cars, after the moment when Victoria Sinclair's gamble fully reversed itself. And the more he thought about it, the less it looked like a retreat. He'd been looking at Victoria's company, not because he'd gone looking for a fight, but because Sylvia, in the process of investigating the eminent domain designation, had uncovered financial documents connected to Sinclair Properties that revealed something Nathan had not expected. Victoria Sinclair was overextended. The development push, all 7 counties simultaneously funded through a combination of bank debt and bonded revenue, had left her development arm critically thin on liquidity. 2 of the county projects were behind schedule. One of the service networks was operating at a loss. The Calverton project itself, which she needed Nathan's property to complete, was the anchor of a financing structure that required completion within 18 months, or triggered a covenant default on $27 million of project debt. She wasn't just trying to buy his house. She needed it. Without it, a portion of her carefully constructed empire had a crack in its foundation. And the crack was precisely the size and shape of Nathan Reed's refusal to sell. He looked at the list again, looked at item 4. He crossed out next step and wrote carefully, in block letters, Sinclair flagship. He stared at it. He stared at Oshim. Then he got up, poured himself a glass of water, stood at the kitchen window looking out at the empty driveway, clean now, every car gone, and thought about what kind of man he was. He was not a man who wanted revenge. He needed to be honest about that, because the feeling that was moving through him at this moment had an edge to it that felt dangerous if you called it the wrong thing. He had watched his daughter ask, "Are we going to be okay?" And he had made a promise. And this, all of this, was about keeping that promise. He thought about Lily's shoebox of rocks under her bed, thought about the tire swing in the backyard, thought about the way she'd watched him from the kitchen window the morning the cars arrived, waiting to see if he was afraid. He hadn't been afraid. He wasn't afraid now. He went back to the table, picked up the legal pad, and started writing. The yellow legal pad sat on the corner of Nathan's kitchen table for 4 days before he picked it up again. Not because he'd forgotten about it, because he needed to be certain about what he was thinking, and certainty, real certainty, the kind you could act on without flinching, took time. Nathan had learned that the hard way, years ago, when he was 24 and had moved fast on a business decision that felt right and turned out to be exactly as wrong as it deserved to be. He'd lost $18,000 and 6 months of work, and he'd sat with that long enough that it left a permanent mark on how he operated. Think slow. Move when you're sure. Don't confuse anger with clarity. He was not angry at Victoria Sinclair. That surprised him a little when he examined it honestly. What he felt was closer to something colder and more useful. The specific focus of a man who had been handed an unexpected advantage and was deciding carefully what to do with it. On the 5th morning, he picked up the legal pad and called Frank Galliano. Frank was his business attorney, a compact, precise man in his early 50s who wore the same style of dark suit every time Nathan saw him and had a habit of repeating key numbers back to you during a conversation to confirm he had them right. He was not warm, exactly, but he was thorough, and thoroughness was what Nathan needed right now. "I want to explore the acquisition of a business," Nathan said. A brief pause. "What kind of business?" "Automotive dealership, specific target. I'll send you what I have." "How serious is this?" "Serious enough that I need to know what I don't know before I take another step." Frank was quiet for a moment. Nathan could hear him clicking a pen. "Send me the materials. I'll have someone pull the public financials and we'll go from there. But Nathan, acquisition work is different from what we've been doing. I'll need to bring in a specialist." "Do it," Nathan said. "And Frank, this needs to stay quiet." "Everything stays quiet," Frank said, which was the closest he ever got to reassuring someone. Nathan sent the materials that afternoon. Everything he'd gathered on Sinclair Automotive Group over the past 3 weeks. Financial disclosures from the county development bond filings, which were public record. A business profile from a commercial database service. The specific documents Sylvia had surfaced during the eminent domain investigation, which showed the liquidity position of Sinclair properties with uncomfortable clarity. 3 years of dealership performance data for the Calverton flagship location, which Nathan had pieced together from a combination of industry sources and public business filings. The flagship was Victoria's original dealership, the one her father had built, the one she had grown up watching him run. It sat on a 12-acre lot on the north side of Calverton, a mixed franchise operation carrying 4 brands, with a service center, a body shop, and a used vehicle lot that moved roughly 400 units a year. It employed 61 people. It was also, based on Nathan's analysis, carrying approximately $8 million in operational and floor plan debt against assets that had been progressively leveraged to fund the development expansion. It was not insolvent, not yet, but it was the kind of balance sheet where a significant external pressure, a major legal setback, a loss of financing confidence, a covenant default on the development debt, could create a cascade problem fast. Nathan understood cascade problems. He'd seen them in engines often enough. One component fails under stress, and suddenly 3 other components are doing work they weren't designed for, and then you're not looking at one problem anymore. He was not trying to destroy Victoria Sinclair. He needed to keep being honest about that, because the line between what he was doing and something uglier was real, and he intended to stay on the right side of it. He was not engineering her collapse. He was positioning himself to make an offer, a real offer, at fair value, for a specific asset, at a moment when the pressures she had created for herself made that offer something she might actually consider. That was the plan. Clean, legal. The kind of thing a businessman did. He told himself that 3 or 4 times over the following week, on the evenings when he sat in the garage after Lily was in bed and tried to make sure his reasons were what he thought they were. He believed it. Mostly. It's possible that a small, quiet part of him also wanted Victoria Sinclair to understand, concretely, what it felt like to have the ground shift under you without warning. He was human enough to admit that, at least to himself. The week that Frank and his acquisition specialist came back with their first assessment, it had been 11 weeks since the cars arrived. The driveway was empty. The garage held only Nathan's own vehicles, the F-150, a partially restored 1967 Camaro that he'd been working on casually for 2 years, and a clean late-model Silverado he'd bought 3 months ago. The legal pads had multiplied. There were 4 of them now, stacked on the kitchen table, covered in his careful, angular handwriting. Frank's specialist was a woman named Carol Shin, no relation to Carol Bassett across the street, though Nathan found the coincidence mildly irritating, who had spent 12 years doing acquisition work for a private equity firm in Cleveland before going independent. She was 41, spoke quickly, used almost no filler words, and had the specific energy of someone who had eaten bad information for lunch so many times that she no longer trusted anything that hadn't been independently verified. Nathan liked her immediately. She came to his kitchen table with a tablet and 2 printed reports in a manila folder. "The flagship is acquirable," she said, not preamble, sitting down and opening the folder. "But the structure is complicated, and the timing matters more than almost anything else." "Walk me through it," Nathan said. She walked him through it for 90 minutes. Nathan asked questions. Carol answered them directly, and twice told him she didn't know yet and would find out, which he appreciated. By the end of it, he had a clear picture of what the deal would need to look like. A purchase offer structured to assume the operational debt, preserve employee positions, and offer Victoria a clean exit from a specific asset, rather than a predatory bid designed to extract maximum concession. The price needed to be fair, not generous. Fair. "If you come in predatory, she'll fight it on principle, and you'll spend 2 years in a legal dispute," Carol said. "But if you come in clean, real money, real assumption of obligations, real protections for the staff, she's got board members who are going to tell her to take it seriously. Because the alternative, if this development financing starts to crack, is worse." "She might take it as an insult," Nathan said. "Coming from me." Carol looked at him steadily. "Yes, she might. Are you prepared for that?" Nathan thought about the morning the cars arrived. The tow trucks, Carol Bassett's phone, the compliance notice, Lily asking, "Are we going to be okay?" "Yeah," he said, "I'm prepared for that." Carol nodded once, made a note on her tablet, and moved to the next section. What Nathan had not told Carol Shin, what he had not told anyone except Sylvia, in broad terms, was that the timing of his acquisition move was not independent of the eminent domain case. The 2 things were connected in a way that made the whole plan either elegant or foolish, depending on how several variables broke. Sylvia had been building her case for 3 months, and 3 weeks ago she had told him, with more confidence than she usually allowed herself, that she believed she could win. The Planning Commission's communications showed a pattern of contact between commission members and Sinclair Properties staff that predated the formal designation by nearly 8 weeks, which meant the process had been initiated before the required independent feasibility study was completed, which was a procedural violation that would likely invalidate the designation entirely. "If I'm right," Sylvia had said, "the eminent domain threat goes away. You keep the property, and she spent legal fees and political capital on a move that ended up doing nothing. And if you're wrong, then we fight it on the merits, and I think we still win, but it takes longer and costs more. How long until you're ready to file? 3 weeks? Maybe 4. Nathan had looked at the calendar. Frank and Carol needed 6 to 8 weeks to prepare the acquisition documentation. If Sylvia filed her challenge in 3 weeks, and the hearing was scheduled within 30 days after that, which was standard, the 2 timelines would converge almost exactly. The eminent domain case would be reaching its critical moment at roughly the same time the acquisition offer landed on Victoria's desk. He hadn't planned that, or rather, he had, but only after the pieces presented themselves. The way a restoration sometimes worked, where you didn't design the car, but you recognized what it was capable of becoming and then made the choices that let that happen. He was not a strategist by nature, but he was very good at seeing what was already there. The town hall meeting was scheduled for the 2nd Thursday in November. Nathan learned about it from Herb Makowicz, who brought over a flyer with the deliberate casualness of a man delivering important information while pretending it was nothing. "Planning Commission wants public comment on the development project," Herb said, standing at Nathan's door with the flyer. "Big meeting. They've got the city council going. Victoria Sinclair's going to present. Nathan took the flyer and read it. It was the formal public hearing on the Calverton development expansion. The one that would, in theory, move the project forward past the preliminary stage and into full approval. Victoria's people had been organizing support for weeks. There would be business owners, Chamber of Commerce members, the inevitable coalition of people whose livelihoods were tied enough to the development money that they'd show up and speak in favor. "You going?" Herb asked. "Yes," Nathan said. Herb nodded. He started to leave, then stopped. "Nathan, half this town is going to be in that room rooting against you." Nathan looked at him. Herb was watching him with the particular expression of a man who had seen enough of life to know that being right didn't always protect you from consequences. "I know," Nathan said. "Just making sure you know." "I appreciate it, Herb." Herb left. Nathan looked at the flyer for another moment, then put it on top of the legal pads. In the weeks between that conversation and the town hall, Nathan was not idle. He continued working. The Camaro he'd been restoring got 3 weeks of serious attention and reached a stage where it was running and drivable, which meant it was entering the final phase that Nathan always found the most interesting. The point where the mechanical work was done and the vehicle's identity started to clarify itself. He'd been uncertain about the color. He still wasn't sure. He also spent time, for the first time in a while, not in the garage. He took Lily to the Natural History Museum in Cleveland on a Saturday, which she had been requesting for 2 months. She wore her field trip face, serious, alert, processing everything, and spent 40 minutes in the dinosaur hall refusing to leave, which Nathan had fully expected. He stood next to her in front of a Cretaceous diorama and watched her read every label twice and thought about the fact that she was going to be, in some specific and not entirely predictable way, formidable. "Dad," she said, without taking her eyes off the display case. "Yeah." "Did you know the T-Rex had really bad vision compared to its smell? Like, it could smell you from like a mile away, but it couldn't see super well up close?" "I didn't know that." "So if a T-Rex was chasing you, the best thing to do is probably go somewhere really smelly so it can't smell you." Nathan considered this. That seems like a logistical problem. "I know." She finally looked at him. "But conceptually, it's a good strategy." He put his hand on top of her head briefly. "Conceptually, yes." She went back to reading the labels. Nathan stood next to her and thought about nothing in particular for a few minutes, which was something he hadn't allowed himself to do in a while, and which felt unexpectedly like relief. On the drive home, Lily fell asleep in the back seat before they were out of Cleveland. Nathan drove south on I-77 in the early dark, the highway mostly empty, and allowed himself to think about what was coming. 3 weeks until Sylvia filed. 6 weeks until the acquisition documents were ready. 8 weeks until the town hall. No, wait. He recounted. The town hall was sooner than that. The town hall was in 5 weeks. He adjusted, thought it through again. The town hall was going to be uncomfortable. He knew that going in. Victoria would present her project to a sympathetic room with professional materials and a polished delivery, and Nathan would be the single visible obstacle to something a lot of people had already decided they wanted. He had no interest in making a scene or delivering a speech designed to generate applause. That wasn't who he was. What he intended to do was say one specific thing clearly at the right moment and let it land where it landed. He'd been thinking about what that thing was for 2 weeks. He'd written 3 versions of it on the legal pad and crossed out 2 of them. The third version was 12 sentences long, and he'd memorized it without meaning to, the way you memorize something you've thought about enough times. He turned south toward Calverton, his daughter sleeping in the back seat, the highway unspooling ahead of him in the dark, and he went through the 12 sentences one more time. Not because he was nervous, because he was the kind of man who prepared. Those 5 weeks moved the way time moves when you're waiting for something, in 2 speeds simultaneously, both too fast and too slow. The days at Decker's were routine. Engines, brakes, diagnostics, Roy's occasional monologues about what was wrong with the auto industry, which Nathan listened to with the patient attention of someone who disagreed on several points and had decided not to say so. The evenings were either the garage or Lily, her homework, which she did with intense focus and occasional dramatic sighing, her dinosaur research, which had expanded to include prehistoric marine life, which she informed Nathan was technically a different category, and he should not confuse them, and the specific small rituals of a household that had learned to run on 2 people instead of 3. Diane sent a birthday card for Lily in October, which was 2 weeks late. Lily read it, said, "It smells like her perfume," and put it in the shoebox with her rocks. Nathan watched her do it and said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. Frank called twice to update him on the acquisition paperwork. Carol Shin sent 3 emails with attached documents that Nathan read carefully and marked up and sent back. Sylvia called once to confirm that she was filing the eminent domain challenge on schedule, which she did, and which generated a small item in the Calverton Courier that described the filing as a legal delay tactic by the Alderman Street holdout. Nathan read the Courier item at breakfast and showed it to Roy at work. Roy read it and handed it back. "Legal delay tactic," he repeated. "That's what they called it." "What would you call it?" "A legal filing," Nathan said. Roy made a sound that was mostly a laugh. "When's the town hall?" 2 weeks. Roy put the newspaper down. He had the look he got when he was deciding whether to say something. Nathan had learned to read this expression over 4 years. It usually meant Roy had an opinion he was uncertain was welcome. "Say it," Nathan said. Roy crossed his arms. Look, I know you've got a plan. I can tell you've got a plan because you're the calmest you've been in 2 months, and that's not normal given what she's been doing to you. And I'm not saying your plan is wrong." He stopped. "But," Nathan said, "but she's got more resources than you, and she knows how things work in this town. Who to call, who owes her what." He shrugged, uncomfortable. "I just want to make sure you're not walking into that room thinking it's going to be a fair fight." Nathan looked at his coffee. "It's not going to be a fair fight," he said. "I'm not expecting a fair fight." "Okay." Roy uncrossed his arms. "So what are you expecting?" Nathan thought about it for a moment. "I'm expecting to say what I came to say and let the rest of it take care of itself." Roy studied him. "That's either very wise or very stupid." "Probably a little of both," Nathan said, and stood up. The night before the town hall, Nathan sat with Lily while she was in bed, and she asked him, out of nowhere, the way kids ask things that have apparently been sitting in them for a while, "Is the lady going to make us move?" He looked at her. She was under her covers with a book open on her chest that she was clearly not reading. "No," he said. "How do you know?" "Because I won't let that happen." She looked at him. "But what if you can't stop it?" He thought about the honest answer to that, which was that there were scenarios where things went badly despite his best efforts, and he was trying to account for all of them, and some of them he couldn't fully control. He thought about whether to say that, and what version of it was the right thing for a 7-year-old to hear. "I've been working on this for a long time," he said instead. "I know what I'm doing." She studied his face with the unsettling directness she'd had since she was 3 years old. The thing where she looked at you like she was checking the structural integrity of what you'd said. Then she nodded and picked up her book. "Okay," she said. "Good night." "Good night, baby." He turned off her lamp and stood in the doorway for a second in the dark, and thought that being a parent was the strangest combination of competence and terror he had ever encountered, and probably always would be. The Calverton Community Center held 400 people. By the time Nathan arrived at 7 p.m., 15 minutes before the meeting started, it was full. He hadn't expected that, or he had abstractly, but walking into the physical reality of it was different. The noise, the density of people, the particular tension of a room where something significant was about to happen. He recognized a lot of faces. The owner of the hardware store, 2 city council members he knew by sight, a woman who had taught Lily's kindergarten class, several people from the neighborhood. Roy was there, near the back, which Nathan hadn't expected. Roy caught his eye and gave a single nod that meant nothing specific and somehow everything. Victoria Sinclair was near the front, standing with 2 men in suits Nathan didn't recognize, and Dennis Holt, who was her acquisition manager, and who had come to Nathan's house twice and left twice without the answer he came for. Victoria was wearing a dark blazer, and she was working the room, moving through it with the ease of someone who had done this many times, speaking to people, shaking hands, leaning in to say specific things to specific people with the concentrated attention that powerful people deploy when they want you to feel chosen. She was good at it. Nathan gave her that. She had presence the way certain cars had presence. You felt her before you fully processed her, before your brain caught up with what your instincts had already registered. She didn't see Nathan when he came in. Or if she did, she didn't show it. He found a seat 3 rows from the back, next to Herb Makovich, who had apparently arrived 40 minutes early and saved him a seat without being asked to, which was the most purely kind thing anyone had done for Nathan in several months, and which he appreciated more than he'd ever say. "Full house," Herb said quietly. "Yeah. You ready?" "Yes." The meeting was called to order at 7:15 by a planning commissioner named Robert Tagg, who had the practiced authority of a man who ran these things often enough to know how to manage a crowd without appearing to manage it. He explained the agenda: public comment, followed by the commission's presentation on the development project, followed by a vote on whether to advance to the next approval stage. Then Victoria was given the floor. She presented for 22 minutes. Nathan listened to all of it. It was a good presentation, clean, clear, specific about jobs and tax revenue and what she called the transformation of Calverton's commercial identity. There were projected images, architectural renderings of the development, glowing and modern and designed to make the current landscape look gray by comparison. There were numbers about economic impact that were almost certainly optimistic, but not obviously false. People applauded twice during the presentation. Not everyone, but enough to fill the room with it. When it was over, Tagg opened the floor for public comment. People spoke in support: the hardware store owner, a woman from the Chamber of Commerce, a man whose son worked for Sinclair Automotive in Columbus, and who delivered a testimonial about what a good employer Victoria was. 2 people spoke against the eminent domain process specifically, citing concerns about the precedent it set. A man named Gerald Tanner, who owned property 3 blocks from Nathan's, gave a 5-minute speech that was genuinely well-reasoned and mostly ignored. Nathan waited. He wasn't the last speaker, but he let the comment period run long before he raised his hand. When Tagg recognized him, the room changed. Not dramatically, not a gasp or a murmur or anything cinematic, just a shift, a settling, the particular silence of people paying attention because they know they're about to see something. Nathan stood up. He didn't have notes. He'd memorized the 12 sentences. "My name is Nathan Reed," he said. "I own the property at the corner of Alderman Street and Route 9. I want to be clear about a few things." The room was very quiet. "First, I understand what this development means to a lot of people in this room. Jobs, revenue, growth. I'm not dismissing any of that. I've listened to this presentation carefully, and I think some of it is real." He paused. Not for effect, because the next thing he said was the thing he'd been working toward, and he wanted to say it correctly. "But I'm also standing here as someone whose property was targeted with a manufactured compliance violation 12 weeks ago. 12 junk vehicles placed on my driveway without consent, documented to create the appearance of abandoned property so that the city would issue fines and I would feel pressure to sell. And then, when that didn't work, an eminent domain designation that my attorney has documented was initiated before the required feasibility study was completed." The quiet in the room got a different quality. Nathan could hear it change. "I'm not here to ask this commission to feel sorry for me. I'm here because I think you should know, before you vote tonight, that the project you're being asked to advance was built on the assumption that one private citizen could be pressured, legally harassed, and ultimately forced out of his home through a process that has serious procedural problems." He looked at Tagg. "My attorney filed a formal challenge to the eminent domain designation last week. I think that challenge is going to succeed. And when it does, the timeline of this project changes significantly, which means the financial structure behind it changes significantly." He didn't look at Victoria. He had decided beforehand not to, and he kept that decision. "I'm not asking this commission to kill the project. I'm asking you to pause the vote tonight until the legal process plays out. Because if you vote to advance based on a foundation that's currently being challenged in court, you're building something on ground that may not be stable." He sat down. The room stayed quiet for about 4 seconds, which is a long time in a full auditorium. Then it wasn't quiet anymore. He didn't hear all of what happened in the next 10 minutes. There was conversation, some raised voices, Tagg calling for order twice. One of the council members asked the city attorney a question that Nathan couldn't fully hear from where he was sitting. The city attorney's answer was short and appeared to create discomfort. Herb leaned over. "That went further than I expected," he said quietly. How do you mean? The council member. They're going to table it. Nathan looked at the front of the room. He could see the council members in a tight cluster, conferring. He could see Robert Tagg looking at his papers with the expression of a man whose evening had not gone the way he planned. He couldn't see Victoria from his angle. He didn't turn to look. 15 minutes later, Tagg announced that in light of the active legal challenge to the eminent domain process, the commission was deferring the vote on project advancement pending resolution of the legal matter. It was not a victory. It was a pause. Nathan understood the difference. But as the room began to break up, the noise rising, people moving, conversations overlapping, he felt something settle in him that had been tight for 12 weeks. Not pride, not satisfaction, just a kind of steadiness, like a machine that had been running rough for a long time had finally found its proper timing. He stood up. Herb clapped him on the shoulder once, briefly, and didn't say anything. Nathan nodded and moved toward the exit. He was almost at the door when he heard his name. He turned. Victoria Sinclair was standing 8 feet away, in the aisle, with the room emptying around her. She was alone. Dennis and the suit men were somewhere else. She looked at him with an expression Nathan couldn't immediately read. Not anger, not contempt. Something more complicated than either. "Mr. Reed," she said. "Miss Sinclair." She held his gaze for a moment. In that moment, Nathan registered things he hadn't allowed himself to register before. That she was younger than he thought she appeared in her public photos. That there was something around her eyes that looked like very controlled exhaustion. And that she was looking at him with what he was starting to recognize, with some surprise, as something close to assessment. The same thing he did with cars. Looking at what was actually there, rather than what she expected. "That was a good speech," she said. It was not what he expected her to say. "It wasn't a speech," he said. "It was just what was true." She looked at him for another second. Then she said, "I know about the Mustang." The statement landed in the air between them and sat there. Nathan didn't respond. He waited. "I had someone trace the Harlan Cross transaction," she said. "The Boss 429. I know what it was, and I know what it sold for." Her voice was even, controlled. But underneath the control, Nathan could hear something. Not quite anger, not quite something else. "I want you to understand that I know." "Okay," Nathan said. "That's all you have to say?" "I'm not sure what you want me to say," Nathan said. "Those vehicles were legally placed on my property, with paperwork constructing me as the owner. I worked on my own property. I sold a car I owned." He paused. "You might have intended it differently, but that's what the paper said." She looked at him for a long time. "You're not what I thought you were," she said finally. "No," Nathan agreed. "I'm not." She turned and walked toward the front of the room where her people were waiting. Nathan watched her go for a moment, then went through the door into the cold November air and stood in the parking lot and let himself breathe. He stayed there for about 2 minutes, long enough to feel the cold properly, long enough to let the room drain out of him. Then he walked to his truck, drove home, checked that the babysitter had put Lily to bed on time, paid her and said goodnight, and went into the garage. He stood in front of the Camaro for a while. He'd been trying to decide about the color for 2 months. He looked at it now. The bare metal of the hood, the curves of the fenders, the proportions of the thing, and knew, suddenly and without doubt, what it needed to be. He picked up his phone and ordered the paint the next morning. The legal pad on the kitchen table had a new item at the bottom of the list now, written in the same block letters as Sinclair Flagship, but smaller, more tentative. It said, "She knows what you're doing." Under that, after a pause, he'd written, "Good." The paint arrived on a Tuesday. 2 quarts of PPG Fathom Green, a color that had existed for exactly 1 model year in 1967 and had not been officially produced since. Nathan had sourced the formula through a specialty supplier in Detroit who mixed it by hand from a spec sheet Nathan had found in a restoration manual he'd owned since he was 19. It wasn't an exact match to anything factory. It was close enough that only someone who had spent serious time with original 67 Camaros would notice the difference, and Nathan had decided that was acceptable. He mixed the first test batch on a Wednesday evening and sprayed a sample panel while Lily was doing homework at the kitchen table. She came out to the garage in her socks to look at it when it was dry. "That's dark," she said. "It's supposed to be." She tilted her head. "It looks like the ocean at night." Nathan looked at the panel. He hadn't thought of it that way, but she wasn't wrong. Yeah, he said. Kind of. She went back to her homework. Nathan stood with the panel in the garage light and looked at the color and felt, for the first time in several weeks, something that was just about the car and nothing else. No legal pads, no acquisition documents, no Victoria Sinclair. Just the color and the metal and the particular quiet of a garage at 9 p.m. when the rest of the world had gone somewhere else. He needed that. He hadn't known how much until it arrived. The days after the town hall had a different quality than the weeks before it. The pressure hadn't gone away. It had shifted. Sylvia called twice with updates on the eminent domain challenge, both times cautiously optimistic. The city's attorney had apparently advised the Planning Commission that the procedural timeline issue Nathan had raised was more serious than initially assessed, which meant the challenge had teeth. Frank and Carol Shin were in the final stage of preparing the acquisition documents. Everything was moving, but moving with the particular deliberateness of legal and financial processes that didn't care about anyone's urgency. What had changed was Victoria. She knew about the Mustang. She'd said so in the parking lot, standing in the cold in her dark blazer while the community center emptied behind them. She'd had someone trace the transaction, which meant she had people watching Nathan more carefully than he'd realized, and it meant she understood, at least partially, what had happened with the 12 cars she'd sent to his driveway. Nathan wasn't sure what she'd do with that knowledge. He thought about it more than he wanted to admit. He ran the scenarios the way he ran mechanical diagnostics, systematically, without assuming the most dangerous outcome first, but not dismissing it either. She could escalate. She had resources he hadn't fully accounted for, and a businesswoman with her track record didn't become that kind of businesswoman by accepting setbacks gracefully. She could come back at him harder, through channels he hadn't anticipated, or she could do what the math suggested she should do, which was take the acquisition offer seriously. The problem was that people, in Nathan's experience, did not always do what the math suggested, especially when the math was being offered by the person who just outmaneuvered them. He was thinking about this on a Thursday morning at Decker's when Roy came into the bay where Nathan was replacing a timing chain on a 2018 Silverado and said, with the particular flatness of someone delivering news they don't know how to frame, "There's someone here to see you." Nathan looked up. Roy's expression was careful. "Who?" "She says her name is Margaret Osei. She works for Sinclair." Nathan set down his ratchet. "What does she want?" "She asked for you by name, said it was personal, not legal." Roy paused. "She's waiting in the lot. I told her I'd ask." Nathan thought for a second, then wiped his hands on a shop rag and went outside. Margaret Osei was standing next to a gray Acura TLX in the parking lot. She was in her mid-40s, wearing a wool coat that was too light for the November cold, and she had the particular posture of someone who has been asked to do something they find professionally uncomfortable but are doing anyway because they were asked by someone they respect. Nathan recognized that posture. He'd worn it himself a few times. "Mr. Reed," she said. "Miss Osei?" He'd never met her before, but he'd seen her name in the Sinclair Group organizational materials Carol Shin had prepared, Director of Strategic Operations, which meant she was close to Victoria and handled things that required discretion. "I'm here on my own, not officially," she said. That was either true or a careful framing, and Nathan filed both possibilities. "Okay," he said. She looked at him for a moment, clearly deciding how to begin. "Victoria is... She doesn't know I'm here. I want to be clear about that." "All right." "I've worked for her for 6 years," Margaret said. "I'm not here to defend what she did to you. What happened with those vehicles was wrong. I said that at the time and it didn't change anything, and I'm not going to pretend it wasn't what it was." Nathan waited. "I'm here because I think she's about to make another mistake. A bigger one." She paused. "She's retained a second law firm, not for the eminent domain, for the Boss 429. Nathan kept his expression even. "What about it?" "She's convinced the transaction can be challenged, that the ownership chain was never legitimately transferred to you, and that the car was removed from your property under false pretenses." Margaret looked at him steadily. "The theory is thin. I told her that. The attorneys told her that. But she's angry in a way that's making her judgment not good right now." Nathan thought for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" Margaret was quiet for a beat. "Because there are 61 people employed at that flagship dealership. Some of them have worked there for 15 years. And whatever happens between Victoria and you, those people are going to be caught in the middle of it if this keeps escalating. She held his gaze. I've read the acquisition documents your team has been preparing, Mr. Reed. Someone in Frank Galliano's office isn't as careful as they think they are. Nathan absorbed this without letting it show. So Victoria's people had seen the documents, or at least knew they existed. And what is it you want me to do with this information? He asked. Nothing specific, she said. I just thought you should know what's coming, and… She stopped, started again more carefully. I thought you should know that there are people inside Sinclair Automotive who understand the financial reality better than Victoria does right now because she's been too close to the situation for too long. And some of those people think your offer, when it comes, is worth taking seriously. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. You're not here on your own, he said. It wasn't an accusation, just a reading of what was actually in front of him. Margaret held his gaze for a second. Then something very slight shifted in her face. Not quite acknowledgement, but close. Drive carefully, Mr. Reed, she said. She got in her car and left. Nathan stood in the parking lot for a moment, watching the Acura pull out onto Maple. Then he went back inside, picked up his ratchet, and finished the timing chain. At lunch, he called Sylvia and told her about the Boss 429 legal threat. She was quiet while he talked, the focused quiet of someone taking notes. They'll have a hard time with it, she said when he finished. The paperwork was constructed by her own people to establish your ownership. To challenge that now, she'd have to argue that her own fraudulent documentation shouldn't be legally binding, which creates its own set of problems. That's what I thought. But it will cost you time and money to defend, even if you win. That's the point. She paused. Nathan, how close are the acquisition documents? Frank says 2 weeks. Then you need to move faster. Her voice was direct, not dramatic. If she files the legal challenge before you deliver the offer, you're fighting on 2 fronts simultaneously, which is exactly where she wants you. Can you push the eminent domain hearing? I can try to request an earlier date. No guarantees. Do it, Nathan said. He called Frank after that and had a conversation that Frank described as uncomfortable and Nathan described as necessary. The result of which was that Carol Shin was asked to compress the remaining documentation work from 2 weeks to 10 days. Carol's response, relayed through Frank, was that she could do it, but it would cost extra. Nathan said fine. He went back to work. The timing chain job took the rest of the afternoon. On the way home, he stopped at the grocery store because they were out of the particular brand of yogurt Lily liked, which was a thing that mattered in a way that was completely disconnected from everything else happening and was, therefore, in its small way, stabilizing. Lily was at the kitchen table with her homework when he got home. She had a math worksheet and a look on her face that suggested the math worksheet had personally offended her. I don't understand fractions, she announced without preamble. You understand fractions, Nathan said. You used them last week when you were measuring the oil for the Camaro. She looked up. That was different. How was it different? That was real. This is… She gestured at the worksheet. This is fractions for no reason. The reason is so you can do the real kind. She considered this with visible skepticism, then looked back at the worksheet. Can you help me? He put the yogurt in the fridge and sat down across from her, and they worked through fractions for 45 minutes, Lily asking sharp questions and occasionally arguing with the methodology in ways that were, if Nathan was being honest, not entirely wrong. By the end of it, she had finished the worksheet and declared fractions still annoying but fine. He made dinner. Lily ate and talked about a conflict she was having with a girl in her class named Priya, which was apparently long-standing and complex and involved a dispute over who had prior claim to a specific spot in the library. Nathan listened and asked 2 questions and did not offer solutions, which was the correct approach. He'd learned that early, that Lily didn't usually want solutions. She wanted to be heard working through something, and the father who jumped in to fix things was usually the father who missed what was actually being said. After she was in bed, he went to the garage and started the final primer coats on the Camaro. He worked until midnight. The work was simple and repetitive. Spray, wait, check, sand, repeat. And it let his mind run loose in a way that the legal and financial thinking didn't. He thought about Margaret Osei standing in the parking lot in her insufficient coat. He thought about what she'd said and what she hadn't said. He thought about Victoria in that community center parking lot. saying, "I know about the Mustang," with that controlled, exhausted expression. The thing that kept returning to him was something he couldn't quite categorize and wasn't sure was useful. He didn't hate her. He'd examined that honestly, over months, and it wasn't there. He understood her in some incomplete way that had nothing to do with sympathy and everything to do with the fact that he'd spent his life understanding how things worked. And Victoria Sinclair was a thing that worked a certain way for specific reasons, and those reasons were not entirely mysterious to him. She had grown up in a world where obstacles were removed. Not always fairly, not always gently, but consistently. The message, delivered over and over across 20 years of building a business empire, was that sufficient force and sufficient resources could move anything that needed to be moved. Nathan had simply been, from her perspective, an obstacle that was taking longer than expected to move. The mistake was that she'd never considered the possibility that the obstacle had its own momentum. He cleaned the spray gun, sealed the primer, and turned off the garage lights. 10 days later, Carol Shin called at 7:30 a.m. to say the documents were ready. Nathan was in his truck in the Deckers parking lot, coffee in hand, not yet inside. He listened to her run through the summary and asked 3 questions, 2 of which she answered fully and 1 of which she said needed a small clarification that would take another day. He said fine on the clarification, told her to have everything ready for a courier delivery by end of week, and hung up. He sat in the truck for a minute. This was the part he'd been working toward for 3 months. The offer document. The moment where everything that had been preparation became action. He'd been focused on getting here with such concentration that now that it had arrived, he noticed a sensation he hadn't fully anticipated. Not nervousness exactly, but something adjacent to it. The specific feeling of a door about to open onto a room whose exact dimensions you didn't know. He'd felt it once before, when he bought the house on Alderman Street. He'd felt it when Diane left. He'd felt it the morning the cars arrived, standing on his porch in his socks. It was the feeling of a hinge point, of the specific moment where what comes after is going to be different from what came before, and you can't unknow that. He finished his coffee and went inside to work. The offer was delivered to Victoria Sinclair's office on a Friday afternoon via private courier. Frank had arranged it, a clean presentation package with the full documentation and a cover letter on Nathan's letterhead that Frank had drafted and Nathan had rewritten twice and finally sent back in something close to Frank's original version, which was tighter than Nathan's and said the same things more efficiently. The letter was brief. It stated that Nathan Reed was prepared to offer a purchase of Sinclair Oa Automotive Group's flagship Calverton dealership at a price Nathan believed represented fair current market value, with full assumption of operational liabilities, commitment to existing employee contracts, and proposed terms for Victoria to remain in a consulting capacity during the transition period should she choose to. It stated that the offer had been prepared in good faith and requested a response within 14 days. The cover letter's last sentence, which was the sentence Nathan had written himself and which Frank had tried to cut and Nathan had put back, read, "I want to be clear that this offer is not made in a spirit of hostility. It is made because I believe both parties have reached a point where a different arrangement serves everyone better than the current one." Frank had called it sentimental. Nathan thought it was necessary. Some things needed to be said plainly, even in a business document, especially in a business document, because the alternative was a transaction that started in ambiguity and stayed there. The 14 days that followed were the most uncomfortable of the entire 3 months. Not because anything specific happened, because nothing happened, which was its own kind of pressure. Sylvia received a hearing date for the eminent domain challenge, December 19th, which was 31 days away. The attorney Victor had retained to challenge the Boss 429 transaction filed a preliminary inquiry with the county, which was essentially a procedural clearing of the throat that meant they were coming but hadn't arrived yet. Nathan's attorney Galliano responded with a 3-page letter that was, in Frank's understated description, fairly comprehensive in establishing the facts. Nathan worked. He painted the Camaro. The Fathom Green went on in 3 coats over 4 evenings, and by the time the last clear coat was dry, the car looked like something that had been waiting its whole life to be that color. He didn't let himself think about whether it was good or not while he was doing it. That was a rule he'd developed, because judgment during the work almost always made the work worse. He just put the paint where it needed to go. On day 11 of the 14, Roy called him into the office. Nathan sat across from Roy in the chair that was the room's only functional piece of furniture. Roy was behind his desk, which was buried under its usual geological layers of paper. He had a coffee mug in both hands, which was what he did when he was uncomfortable. "I got a call yesterday," Roy said. "From who?" Roy looked at his coffee. "Victoria Sinclair." Nathan was quiet. "She called directly, didn't use a middleman." Roy set down the mug. "She was polite, asked about the shop, how long we'd been open, what our annual service volume was." "What did you tell her?" "The truth. I didn't know what else to do." He looked at Nathan. "She asked if I knew about your acquisition offer." "What did you say?" "I said, I knew you had some business interests outside the shop, but I didn't know the specifics." Roy paused. "Which is technically true." Nathan looked at the wall behind Roy's head, thinking. "She's not interested in the shop," he said. "She's trying to understand who you are to me, whether you're a liability she can use." Roy absorbed this. "Are you saying she'd come after the shop to get to you?" "I'm saying she might consider it." He looked at Roy. "She won't, though." "How are you so sure?" "Because she's a businesswoman and attacking a local auto shop gains her nothing strategically. She's fishing for information, not setting up a move." Nathan paused. "What else did she say?" Roy was quiet for a second. "She asked if I thought you were someone who could actually run a dealership." The room was quiet. "What did you tell her?" Nathan said. Roy picked up his coffee mug again. He looked at it for a long moment, then looked up at Nathan. "I told her that in 4 years, I'd never seen you walk away from something that needed fixing, and that every car you touched ran better when you were done with it than when you started. And that I thought that probably answered her question." Nathan didn't say anything for a moment. "That's not a bad answer," he said finally. "No," Roy said. "I didn't think so either." He set the mug down. "She's going to take the offer, Nathan. That's my read. She called me because she's trying to make herself comfortable with the decision she's already most of the way to." Nathan considered that. Roy was not a subtle man, but he understood people well enough. The daily work of a shop owner was essentially the work of reading what customers actually wanted versus what they said they wanted, and Roy had done it for 20 years. "Maybe," Nathan said. "Not maybe." Roy shook his head. "She knows the legal case is falling apart. She knows the eminent domain thing is going to fail. She knows about the Mustang, and she knows you're smarter about money than she gave you credit for. And now she's calling the mechanic's boss to see if the mechanic is the real deal." He spread his hands. "What does that tell you?" Nathan thought about Victoria in the community center parking lot. "You're not what I thought you were." The way she'd looked at him. Not with contempt, not with anger, but with that assessing look, like she was revising a calculation. "It tells me she's doing her due diligence," he said. "It tells you she's already decided," Roy said. "She just needs to make peace with it first." Nathan left the office and went back to work. He didn't let himself think too hard about whether Roy was right, because the moment you started assuming a deal was done was the moment you stopped paying attention to the ways it could still fall apart. But Roy's words sat with him through the rest of the day and through the evening and into the following morning when his phone rang at 8:15 and the number on the screen was one he didn't recognize, but that had a Calverton area code. He picked it up. "Mr. Reed?" Victoria Sinclair's voice. Measured, as always, but something in the texture of it was different from the parking lot, different from what he'd imagined she'd sound like in this moment, less controlled than her public register, which meant she'd called without a script. "Ms. Sinclair," he said, a pause that lasted maybe 3 seconds. "I'd like to meet. Not through lawyers. Just the two of us." Another pause. "I think we have things to say to each other that probably shouldn't go through intermediaries." Nathan was in his kitchen. He looked at the legal pad on the table, so the 4 pages of notes, the blocked letter words at the bottom. He looked at the window, where the backyard was gray with November morning and the tire swing was turning slightly in the wind. "All right," he said. "When?" "Tomorrow. There's a diner on Route 12 called Emmett's. Do you know it?" "I know it." 10 a.m. "I'll be there," he said. She hung up. Nathan set the phone down. He looked at the tire swing for a moment. Then he picked up the legal pad and turned to a fresh page and sat down at the table and started writing. Not strategy. Not preparation points. Just what he actually thought, what this meeting was, stripped of tactics. He wrote for about 15 minutes, then stopped and read what he'd written, and then folded the page in half and put it under his coffee mug. He wasn't going to bring it to the diner. He didn't need it there. But it mattered to have written it, because Nathan Reed was a man who needed to know what he actually thought before he walked into a room, and for 3 months the noise of the situation had made that harder than usual. What he'd written, in the plain, slightly cramped handwriting he'd had since the 8th grade, came down to this. He was going to walk into that diner and sit across from a woman who had tried to ruin him, and he was going to do it without resentment and without performance, because the business they needed to do was real business, and real business required both people in the room to be present and honest and willing to look at what was actually true. He wasn't forgiving her. That was a different conversation, for a different time, or maybe never. Forgiveness was something you arrived at in your own time on your own terms, and Nathan wasn't sure he was there yet and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But he was willing to sit across a table from her and do the work that needed doing. That was enough for tomorrow. That evening, he finished the clear coat on the Camaro and spent an hour doing final detail work, buffing out 2 small orange peel patches on the driver's door, touching up a thin run on the rear quarter that had been bothering him for a week. When he was done, he stepped back and looked at the car under the garage lights. Lily appeared in the doorway from the house in her pajamas, which she was not supposed to be in because it was only 9 o'clock and she was supposed to be reading. "I heard you out here," she said. "You're supposed to be in bed." "I'm not tired." She looked past him at the Camaro. Her face changed. "Oh," she said. "Yeah." She walked fully into the garage and stood next to her father, looking at the car. The Fathom green caught the light in the particular way dark colors caught garage light, deep and layered and slightly different depending on where you stood. "So pretty," Lily said quietly. Then she looked at him. "Is it done?" "Almost. Still needs the interior finished, chrome trim reinstalled, but the paint's done." "Did you always know it was going to look like that?" He thought about it honestly. "No, I figured it out while I was working." She nodded, like that made sense to her. She looked at the car for another moment, then looked up at him. "Dad, are things going to be different soon?" He looked down at her. Her dark eyes were serious the way they got when she'd been thinking about something and decided to say it. "Different how?" he asked. She shrugged, a kid's shrug that meant, "I don't know exactly, but I feel something changing. Just different, like bigger." He put his hand on her shoulder. "Yeah," he said. "I think things are going to be different." She looked back at the car. "Is that okay?" He thought about tomorrow. The diner. The drive up Route 12 in the morning. The woman sitting across the table from him and what they'd both carry into that room and what they'd need to set down. "Yeah," he said. "It's okay." Lily leaned against his arm briefly. Not a hug, just contact, the way she did sometimes when she didn't have words for something. And then she pushed off and said, "Okay, I'm going to bed now," with the decisiveness of someone who had gotten what they came for. He listened to her footsteps down the hall. He stood in the garage with the Camaro for a few more minutes, alone with the smell of paint and the cold air coming under the door, and the particular silence that came after a long project reached the end of its hardest phase. Then he turned off the lights and went inside. Emmett's Diner on Route 12 was the kind of place that had been exactly the same for 30 years and intended to stay that way. Vinyl booths in faded burgundy. A counter with 9 stools, 7 of which wobbled. Coffee that came in heavy ceramic mugs and tasted like it had been brewed with conviction rather than precision. The kind of place where the menu was laminated and hadn't changed since the second Bush administration, and nobody who ate there regularly considered that a problem. Nathan arrived 8 minutes early. He took a booth near the back window, away from the counter, where the morning regulars were arranged on their stools with the comfortable immobility of men who had been sitting in those exact spots for decades. He ordered coffee and sat with his hands around the mug and watched the parking lot through the window. He'd slept adequately. Not well. He'd woken at 4:30 and lain there for an hour, with his mind running the kind of slow, circular loops that weren't useful and couldn't be stopped. And he'd eventually given up and gone to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table with the folded page from the legal pad under his hand, not reading it, just aware of it. He'd thought about what Roy had said, about what Margaret Osei had said in the parking lot at Decker's, about the particular quality of Victoria's voice on the phone, that absence of a script which he'd filed and kept returning to. Lily had found him in the kitchen at 6:15, still in her pajamas, and without saying anything had poured herself a glass of orange juice and sat across from him, and they had shared the kitchen quietly for 20 minutes, which was one of the things Nathan valued most about his daughter. She understood, with a maturity that had no right to exist in a 7-year-old, that sometimes the best thing two people could do was occupy the same space without filling it. He dropped her at school at 7:45. She'd taken her backpack, climbed out of the truck, walked 4 steps toward the entrance, then turned around and came back. "Hey," she said through the open window. "Hey, good luck today." He looked at her. "How do you know I need luck today?" She gave him the look, the structural integrity look. "Dad." "Right," he smiled. "Thanks, baby." She turned and walked into school without looking back, which was very much her style, and Nathan had driven to Emmett's with the particular warmth of a man who has been seen clearly by someone who loves him. Victoria arrived at 10:02. Nathan watched her park, a dark blue Audi, not flashy, which he noted without assigning too much meaning to it. She came through the door and saw him immediately, and there was a half-second where she stood just inside the entrance and they looked at each other across the diner, and then she walked over and sat down across from him. She was dressed down, relative to what he'd seen before. Dark slacks, a gray sweater, no blazer. Her hair was pulled back. She looked, in the fluorescent reality of Emmett's diner, younger than she did in the deliberate context of conference rooms and public meetings, and also more tired. The controlled exhaustion he'd registered in the community center parking lot was still there, but less concealed in this light. She looked at his coffee. "Does that actually taste good?" "No," he said, "but it's hot." She flagged down the waitress, a woman named Janet, according to her name tag, who had the practiced efficiency of someone who had been taking orders in this specific diner for many years, and ordered a coffee and a glass of water and did not look at the menu. They waited for the coffee to arrive. Neither of them spoke. Nathan didn't find the silence uncomfortable. He wasn't sure what Victoria found it. Janet set the coffee down and left. Victoria wrapped both hands around the mug. It was, Nathan noticed, the same thing he'd done when he arrived, which meant nothing and which he noticed anyway. "I want to say something before we talk business," she said. "Okay?" She looked at him directly. "What I did, the vehicles, the compliance filing, the eminent domain designation, it was wrong. Not just strategically wrong, actually wrong." She said it without decoration, without the kind of careful hedging that people used when they were apologizing while not quite apologizing. "I treated you like an obstacle instead of a person, and I used systems I had access to in ways that weren't right. And I'm not saying that because my lawyers told me to say it. I'm saying it because I've been sitting with it for 3 months, and it's the truth." Nathan looked at her. He had anticipated several versions of this meeting, and in some of them she had opened this way, and in those versions he'd planned to say something measured and move on. But hearing it said plainly, without negotiating language, without the soft architectural padding that powerful people use to make accountability more comfortable, he found that his planned response didn't quite fit. "I appreciate that," he said. And then, because it was true and he'd decided to say true things, "It wasn't the worst thing anyone's ever done to me, but it was close." Something moved across her face. "Fair," she said. "How did you decide on 12? He asked. She looked at him. "What?" 12 cars. Why 12 specifically?" A pause. Then, unexpectedly, something that was almost a laugh, short, involuntary, quickly contained. Dennis thought it would look more overwhelming, more like an accumulation rather than a single deliberate act. She shook her head slightly. In retrospect, the number was not the most significant design flaw in that plan. "No," Nathan agreed. "It wasn't." She looked at her coffee. He looked at his. Outside, a truck pulled into the lot, idled, pulled back out. "The Mustang," she said. "Yeah." "My appraiser looked at those vehicles for 40 minutes total." She said it without inflection, but there was something under it. Not embarrassment exactly, but the specific discomfort of someone who prided themselves on competence confronting a competence failure. He was looking for anything of obvious value, anything that would complicate the optics. He didn't find anything. He didn't know what to look for, Nathan said. Not generously, not harshly, just as a fact. No. She was quiet for a moment. How long did it take you to identify it? About 2 hours with the VINs. I was certain when I put my hands on the chassis rail that night. She absorbed this. And you didn't consider telling anyone, contesting the paperwork, arguing the ownership was fabricated. I considered it, Nathan said. I decided the paperwork said what it said, and I owned what I was told I owned, and I was going to treat it accordingly. She looked at him steadily. That's a very clean reading of a situation that was designed to be unfair to you. I know. Most people wouldn't have thought of it that way. Most people would have been too angry, Nathan said. I was angry too. I just didn't let it run the whole show. She was quiet for a moment, then, You have a daughter. It wasn't a question, but he answered it. 7 years old. You're raising her alone. Her mother is around when she can be, but mostly, yes. Victoria looked at the window. My father built the Calverton flagship when I was 9. I spent summers there. Ran the front desk when I was 12 because one of the receptionists quit and he needed help. She paused. I never really thought about it as something someone else might want. It was always just mine. Part of the furniture of how I understood my own life. Nathan let this sit. That's part of why this is hard, she said. Not the business part. The business part I can deal with. It's the... She stopped, started again. It's the idea of handing it to someone who wouldn't be me. That's honest, Nathan said. I'm trying to be. He looked at her. Can I ask you something? Yes. The development project, Calverton, the other counties, you knew the financing was tight. You knew it when you started pushing harder on my property. Did you know then that if the eminent domain failed, the timeline problems would cascade into the bond covenants? She didn't answer right away, which was itself an answer. I believed I could make it work, she said carefully. That's not what I asked. A longer pause. I knew it was possible, she said. I assessed it as manageable. And now? She looked at her coffee. Now I assess it differently. Nathan leaned back in the booth. He wasn't going to press the point. It was made. She understood that he understood the financial picture, and she understood that his offer had arrived at a moment that was not coincidental. Whether she wanted to say that out loud was her business. My offer is what the documents say it is, Nathan said. Fair market on the flagship. Full liability assumption. 61 employees stay, same terms. You can stay as a consultant through transition if you want, or you can walk away clean. Either way works for me. He paused. I'm not trying to take something from you. I'm trying to buy something that solves a problem you have and gives me something I've been building toward. What have you been building toward? She asked. Not skeptically, actually asking. Nathan thought about how to answer that. A business I can be proud of. Something my daughter can see and understand. Not the biggest thing in the state. Just something real, that runs right, that takes care of the people in it. He looked at her. I know that probably sounds plain to someone with your operation. It doesn't, she said quietly. It sounds like what my father wanted when he started. The word father sat in the space between them for a moment. The consulting arrangement, Victoria said. In the offer documents, it's described as optional, but you included it. Yes. Why? Nathan picked up his coffee. It had gone lukewarm. Because the people who work at that dealership know you. They trust how things run because you built how things run. I can run a shop. I've been doing it my whole life at various scales, but I don't know your service system or your vendor relationships or the institutional memory of a 12-year operation. You do. And if you're willing to share that knowledge, I'd rather learn from the source than figure it out by making expensive mistakes. She studied him. That's practical. Yes. It's also... She stopped. What? She looked slightly uncomfortable, which was the most human expression he'd seen on her face. It's kinder than you needed to be, given everything. Nathan shrugged. It's not about being kind, it's about making the thing work. But if being honest about what I need happens to be decent, I'm not going to apologize for that. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I have 2 board members who have already told me to take the offer. My CFO has been telling me for 6 weeks that the development financing needs to be restructured, and selling the flagship cleans up enough of the liquidity problem to buy time to do that properly. She looked at her hands. My attorney who filed the Boss 429 challenge called me yesterday to say he thought the case was thin and he couldn't in good conscience recommend pursuing it. What did you tell him? I told him to withdraw it. Nathan nodded slowly. Which means, Victoria continued, that we're sitting in this diner and I'm telling you that the rational decision, financially and legally, is to accept your offer. She looked up at him. But I want you to understand that accepting it is not something I'm doing casually. That building it matters to me in a way that doesn't fit into financial analysis. I know, Nathan said. I need you to take care of it. The sentence was plain and direct and completely unguarded, and Nathan recognized that it cost her something to say it that plainly. He looked at her for a moment. I will, he said. He meant it the way he meant things when he said them simply, without ceremony. The way he meant I'm not in trouble to Lily on the morning the cars arrived. Not as a promise that covered every possible scenario, as a statement of what he intended and who he was. Victoria held his gaze for a second, then looked out the window. Her coffee was untouched. Nathan's was cold. Janet came by and refilled both mugs without being asked. There's a condition, Victoria said, after Janet left. Tell me. The eminent domain case. I want to withdraw it before the hearing. Nathan looked at her. Sylvia Parks already built the case. I know. I'm not asking you to drop your challenge. I'm saying I want to withdraw the designation before the hearing, so it goes away without a ruling. She met his gaze. If there's a ruling, it goes into the public record. It's precedent. It has implications for my other development projects that go beyond Calverton. She paused. If I withdraw, it's gone, and you get the same outcome. Nathan thought about this. Sylvia isn't going to like that. I imagine not. She built something good. A brief pause. She's a good attorney. She is. What I'm offering you is the same practical result. Your property is yours, the designation disappears, the legal proceedings end, without the public ruling. And in exchange, I accept the acquisition offer and we move forward. Nathan looked at the window. The parking lot was quiet. A red pickup sat in the far corner with its engine running, someone inside it he couldn't see. He thought about Sylvia. She had worked the case carefully for 3 months, and she deserved the win, and she knew it. She was also a practical woman who understood that the outcome her client needed was the security of his property, not the particular form through which it was achieved. He thought about what a public ruling might mean, not for him, but for the 61 people at the flagship dealership, for the vendors and contractors in Victoria's other projects, for the employees in her 11 other locations. Forcing a public record that damaged her broader operation didn't serve anyone Nathan cared about. He thought about what Roy had said. She's trying to make herself comfortable with a decision she's already most of the way to. I'll talk to Sylvia today, he said. If she agrees the withdrawal satisfies the case, then yes. Victoria nodded once. Fair. They sat there for a moment, both of them around cold coffee in a diner on Route 12, having just done the essential work. Can I ask you something now? Victoria said. Yes. The morning the cars arrived, Carol Bassett's video, she filmed you standing on your porch and you were just standing there. Not angry, not making calls, not... She paused. What were you actually thinking? Nathan considered the question. I was counting them, he said. She stared at him. You were counting the cars. I wanted to know exactly how many there were before I did anything else. A long silence. Then she said very quietly, 12. 12, he confirmed. Something passed across her face. Complicated, not quite the almost laugh from earlier, something with more weight to it. She picked up her coffee and drank it even though it was still too hot and set it back down. Well, she said. Yeah, Nathan said. Nathan called Sylvia from the parking lot at Emmett's, standing next to his truck, while Victoria's Audi pulled out onto Route 12 and disappeared south toward Calverton. The morning had gone pale and the temperature had dropped while they'd been inside. He could see his breath. Sylvia answered on the second ring. How was the meeting? She asked, which meant someone had told her about it, which meant it was probably Frank, which Nathan would address later. Good. I need to talk to you about the hearing. He explained Victoria's condition. Sylvia was quiet through all of it, the full working quiet of someone processing rather than waiting for a pause to speak. When he finished, she said nothing for about 5 seconds. "She wants to withdraw before the ruling," Sylvia said. "Yes." "To protect her other projects." "Yes." Another pause. "Nathan, what I've built here is solid. The ruling would have been significant, not just for you. It would have set a standard on how these designations can be used for private benefit." She stopped. "I want you to understand what you're trading." "I understand." "Do you?" "Because this case could help people beyond you, future cases, people who don't have a Sylvia Park." Nathan was quiet for a moment. It was a real point, and he wasn't going to dismiss it. "You're right," he said, "and I don't want to tell you your work doesn't matter, because it does. But I need you to tell me honestly. Does a withdrawal from your professional standpoint constitute a satisfactory resolution for your client?" Silence. "Yes," she said, reluctantly but clearly. "Then I think we take it." She exhaled. "The acquisition? It's happening?" "I think so. She'll need a few days to formalize her decision with the board." "She'll take it," Sylvia said. "I've seen the financials. She doesn't have another move that works as well." "I know. I still wish we were going to the hearing." "I know that too," Nathan said. "Write it up. Everything you built. Send it to one of the property rights organizations. Let it be useful somewhere." A brief pause, then, "That's actually not a bad idea." "I'm full of not bad ideas." "Don't push it," she said, but her voice had the particular dryness of someone who was, underneath the professional frustration, not unhappy with how things had landed. He hung up and stood in the parking lot a moment longer. He looked north up Route 12, which was empty in both directions. A crow was sitting on the phone line above the diner entrance, looking at nothing in particular with the complete indifference of a creature that had no investment in human business. Nathan got in his truck and drove back toward Calverton. The board meeting where Victoria formally presented the acquisition to Sinclair Automotive's board of directors happened the following Tuesday. Nathan was not there, obviously, but Carol Shin had a contact who was adjacent to the proceedings, and she relayed the broad outlines. 2 board members had advocated for acceptance from the start. One had wanted to explore other options that turned out to be less concrete than they sounded. And the CFO had presented a financial analysis that Carol described as not subtle in its conclusions. The vote was 4-1 in favor of moving forward with the acquisition. Nathan received the formal acceptance notice from Victoria's attorney on a Wednesday afternoon. He was at Decker's, in the middle of an oil change that he handed off to the junior mechanic when his phone rang, which Roy noted was the first time in 4 years Nathan had abandoned an oil change midway. "The board approved it," Frank said. "We're in due diligence. 30 days. "Who's handling it on their side?" "Margaret Osei." Nathan paused. "Of course it is," he said. Frank didn't ask what that meant. "I'll need you available for questions throughout the month, and Carol wants to sit down with you this week to walk through the transition structure." "Set it up." He hung up and stood in the parking lot, the same parking lot where Margaret had stood in her inadequate coat 3 weeks ago, and let the information arrive fully. 30 days of due diligence, then closing. Then the flagship dealership on the north side of Calverton, with its 12 acres and 4 brands and 61 employees, was going to need a general manager. He had not fully thought through the operational reality of running a 12-acre dealership while simultaneously, he paused on this thought and acknowledged it cleanly, while not abandoning the life he'd built, the morning routines and the homework help and the Camaro in the garage and the tire swing in the backyard. He had money now. He had, for the first time in his life, enough money to make choices that previous versions of himself couldn't have made. But money didn't solve the time problem, and the time problem was real. He went back inside and finished the oil change himself. He told the junior mechanic it was fine, he was just stepping out, which wasn't entirely honest, but was kind. Roy found him afterward cleaning up at the sink. "Well," Roy said, "due diligence starts this week, close in 30 days if it holds." Roy nodded. He was quiet for a moment, which, with Roy, usually preceded something important. "You're going to need to hire a general manager." "I know someone," Roy said. His voice was careful. "Solid. 20 years in dealership operations. Left her last position when the owner sold to a group that restructured the management, and she didn't fit the new structure. She's been consulting for 18 months, and she's bored. He paused. Her name's Deborah Hart. She ran a 4-franchise store in Columbus for 8 years, and it was one of the best-rated service operations in the state. Nathan looked at him. How do you know her? She's my cousin. Roy's expression was the specific combination of professional and slightly embarrassed that family recommendations produced. I'm not saying that to push you. I'm saying it because she's the right person, and you're going to need a right person. Nathan dried his hands. Send me her number. Roy nodded, visibly relieved that he hadn't had to argue it. She'll want to meet you first. She's careful about who she works for. Good, Nathan said. So am I. The due diligence month was the most exhausting 30 days Nathan could remember since the first year after Diane left, when he'd been learning to run a household entirely alone while grieving and working full-time and trying to appear fully functional for a 4-year-old. The legal and financial review process required his attention in ways that didn't fit into evenings and weekends. There were documents to review, questions to answer, 2 formal sessions with Margaret Osei that were professionally correct and personally civil in a way that suggested she was whatever her role in the earlier events had been, someone who did her job cleanly. He met Deborah Hart on a Thursday evening at a coffee shop in Canton. She was 53, compact, with short gray hair and the kind of eyes that evaluated things quickly and without apparent judgment. She had looked at the dealership financials before the meeting. Carol had sent them, with Nathan's authorization. And she came with 3 pages of notes. They talked for 2 hours. She asked him about his operational philosophy, which he described plainly, and which she pushed back on twice in ways that turned out to be right. He asked her about her management approach, her experience with service operations specifically, and what she'd done differently in hindsight at the Columbus dealership. She answered all 3 honestly, including the hindsight question, which told him something important about her. Near the end of the conversation, she said, "You know that taking over a 12-year operation from a founder is one of the hardest things to do in this business." "I know," he said. "The employees are loyal to how things were. They'll test you. Some of them will leave regardless of how well you handle it." "I know. And you're coming in after a very public conflict with the previous owner, which means every person in that building is going to be watching how you treat her legacy. Every decision you make in the first 6 months is going to be read as a statement." Nathan looked at her. "Are you trying to talk me out of it?" "No," she said. "I'm making sure you understand what you're walking into, because I've seen people buy dealerships without understanding it, and it goes badly, and the people who work there pay the price." She looked at him steadily. "If you understand all of that and you still want to do it the way you're describing, then yes, I'll run it for you." "I understand all of it," Nathan said. She nodded. "Okay. And Deborah, if this works, I want you managing it as a partner structure eventually. Not from day one, but within 2 years, if the numbers support it, I want you to have equity." She was quiet for a moment. "That's not a standard offer." "No." "Why?" "Because I don't want someone running my business who doesn't have a stake in what it becomes." He looked at her. "And because Roy told me you left your last position because the new ownership group didn't value what you'd built, and I don't want to repeat that with someone who's going to build something for me." Something shifted very slightly in Deborah's face. She looked at her notes for a moment, then back at him. "Roy said you were unusual," she said. "Roy says a lot of things, most of them accurate, in my experience." She picked up her coffee. 2 years. If the numbers support it. She held his gaze. "Deal." The closing happened on a Friday in December, 3 days before the eminent domain hearing that did not take place because Victoria withdrew the designation on a Tuesday morning. Nathan was in Sylvia's office when Sylvia got the notification, and he watched her read it with the specific expression of a woman who had won, in a way that gave her no procedural satisfaction whatsoever. "It's done," Sylvia said. "Yeah." She looked at him. "I sent the case materials to 3 organizations. 2 of them responded the same day." "Good. Don't thank me. I did it because it was the right thing to do, not because you suggested it." "I know," Nathan said. "That's why it'll actually get used." She almost smiled at that, folded the notification, filed it. The closing was at a title company in downtown Calverton, in a conference room with a long table and too many attorneys and coffee that was marginally better than Emmett's. Nathan and Victoria sat on opposite sides of the table, which struck Nathan as slightly absurd given where they'd been 9 days ago in that same diner. But he understood that this was the formal world, and the formal world had its staging. They signed documents for 2 hours. Nathan's hand was tired by the end of it. He noticed that Victoria signed everything quickly and without hesitation, which surprised him until he remembered what she'd said. The rational decision is to accept, and understood that she had made her peace with this before she ever sat down. When the last document was signed and the title company representative announced that the transaction was complete, there was a brief, strange moment of silence in the room. Nathan looked across the table at Victoria. She was looking at the stack of signed documents. Then she looked up. "Take care of it," she said. The same words as at Emmett's. "I will," Nathan said. The same answer. She nodded. She picked up her bag and stood and said goodbye to her attorneys and walked out of the conference room. Nathan heard her footsteps in the hallway, and then the outer door, and then nothing. Frank said something procedural that Nathan heard and responded to appropriately. Carol said something about the first month of operations. Margaret Osei, who was across the table, gathered her materials with efficient movements and caught Nathan's eye briefly before she left, and the look was brief and unreadable, and he decided to call it mutual acknowledgement and leave it there. He drove to Decker's afterward. He didn't know why exactly. He hadn't planned to. He just found himself pulling into the familiar parking lot out of the habit of 1,000 other days. Roy was in the shop, which was where Roy was always. He looked up when Nathan came in, read something in his face, and said, "Done?" "Done," Nathan said. Roy looked at him for a moment. "How do you feel?" Nathan thought about it honestly. He felt tired. He felt the specific, groundless exhaustion of a period of sustained high stakes finally resolving. He felt something that wasn't quite triumph. It was quieter than that, less performed, more like the feeling at the end of a long restoration when you started the engine and it ran and you stood back and thought, yes, that's what this was supposed to be. "Like it's the beginning of something," he said. Roy nodded slowly. "Yeah, that tracks." He picked up a rag from the workbench, held it, put it down. "You gonna keep working here?" Nathan looked at him. Roy was asking something more than the literal question, and Nathan knew it. Roy was 54 years old, and Decker's Auto was his entire professional life, and he was asking, without asking, whether Nathan's new chapter meant the end of this one. "I own a dealership," Nathan said. "I don't know how to run it yet. I'm going to need help." He paused. "And I'm still the best mechanic you've got." Roy stared at him for a moment. Then he made the sound that was mostly a laugh and pointed at the Silverado in Bay 2 that had been waiting for a diagnosis since yesterday. "Then get changed," he said. "That transmission isn't going to figure itself out." Nathan changed. He got under the Silverado. The transmission was a mess. Someone had been ignoring noises for too long, which people did, because ignoring things that needed attention was one of the most human of all human behaviors. He worked through the diagnosis methodically, following the noise to its source, and thought about what came next, and thought about Lily, and thought about the flagship dealership sitting empty on its 12 acres waiting for a Monday morning, and thought about Deborah Hart and her 3 pages of notes, and thought about a garage on Alderman Street with a Camaro in it that was the color of ocean at night. He was still under there at 4:30 when his phone buzzed on the creeper beside him. He picked it up without getting out. A text from Lily. She was at the after-school program and had apparently just learned, from a book about American manufacturing history, that the Ford Mustang had been introduced to the public at the 1964 World's Fair. And she wanted to know if Nathan knew this, and also if it was the same kind of Mustang as the one in the garage that you sold. He typed back, "Yes, I knew. Not exactly the same, but same family. Why?" 3 dots. Then, "Just doing research." Then, after a pause, "I think we should get one someday." He lay under the Silverado and read that message twice and felt something simple and uncomplicated move through him. "We will," he typed back. "I promise." He put the phone down and went back to work. The Monday morning, Nathan Reed walked through the front doors of the Calverton flagship dealership, as its owner was a cold, flat-skied day in late December, the kind of Ohio winter morning that offered nothing in the way of atmosphere or drama, just gray light and frozen ground and breath visible in the air. He arrived at 7:40, which was 20 minutes before the official staff meeting he and Deborah had scheduled, because he had wanted to walk the building alone first, before the day filled up with people and decisions and the particular noise of a business in transition. The building was larger than it felt from the outside. The showroom floor held 11 vehicles arranged across polished concrete, the lighting designed to make chrome and paint look their best at any hour. The service bays, 8 of them, all equipped, were off a corridor to the left, clean and organized in the specific way of a shop that had been run with discipline for years. The used lot sat behind the main building, 112 units currently on the ground. Nathan walked through all of it slowly, not inspecting, exactly, just getting a physical sense of the place the way he got a physical sense of any machine he was about to be responsible for. He stood in the service corridor for a few minutes and listened. The building had its own sounds, the ventilation system, the particular acoustic of concrete and metal and high ceilings. He thought about Victoria's father building this place when she was 9 years old. He thought about what it would mean to Lily if she came here 20 years from now and the place was still standing and still good. He wanted it to be still good. That was the whole thing, really. That was what he'd written on the folded page on the legal pad, and what he'd never quite said to anyone in exactly those terms. He wanted to build something that was still good after he'd touched it. Not bigger necessarily, not flashier, just better than it found him, and worth keeping. He was standing in the service corridor when Deborah Hart arrived at 7:50, which was 10 minutes before she needed to be there, which told Nathan she was the kind of person who arrived early to feel the space before the day started, same as him. She came through the service entrance with a coffee in each hand and found him standing in the corridor. "You were here before me," she said. "I wanted to walk it alone first." She handed him one of the coffees. Good instinct. He took it. "What do you know about the service manager?" "Brian Cho, 41. Been here 9 years. He ran the Columbus Honda store's service department before this. He's good." She paused. "He's also the one the other employees are going to watch most closely in the first month. Whatever relationship you build with him sets the tone." "I figured," Nathan said, "which is why he's the first conversation I'm having this morning." Deborah nodded. She looked down the corridor at the bays. "You know, most buyers don't walk the service department first. They start in the showroom. The showroom is cosmetic. The service department is the business." She looked at him. "Victoria used to say the same thing." Nathan absorbed that. "Then she built it on the right foundation," he said. "I just have to not break what's already working while I fix what isn't." Deborah looked at him for a second. "You're going to be fine," she said, with the particular dryness of someone who'd worked for enough people who weren't fine to mean it as a real assessment. The staff meeting happened in the customer lounge, which was the largest interior space available. 47 of the 61 employees were present. The others were either on scheduled days off or had called to confirm they'd be in for the following week. Nathan stood at the front of the room while Deborah stood to one side, and he looked at the faces looking back at him. Anxious faces, careful faces, faces arranged in the expressions of people who had been through a transaction and didn't yet know what it meant for them. He had thought about what to say and had decided against a speech. He had decided for honesty in plain language, which was how he handled every difficult conversation. "My name is Nathan Reed," he said. "Most of you know that much already. Here's what I want you to know beyond that." He paused. "I'm a mechanic. I've been working on cars since I was 16, and I've been running restoration work out of my own garage for about the same amount of time. I'm not coming into this business from finance or from corporate. I'm coming from a shop, which means I understand what you actually do here better than you might expect." The room was listening, not relaxed. That would take time, but present. "I'm also honest enough to tell you that running a dealership at this scale is different from what I've done before, and I'm going to make mistakes. And when I do, I want you to tell me, because I'd rather be corrected quickly than wrong for a long time." He looked around the room. "Deborah Hart is going to be running day-to-day operations. She has more dealership experience than I do, and I trust her judgment. What I'm going to do is be here, be accessible, and make sure this place runs in a way everyone here can be proud of working at." A man near the back, Nathan recognized him from the organizational chart as Brian Cho, raised his hand. "Mr. Reed, what happens to Victoria's operational protocols? Service pricing, the vendor relationships she'd built, are those staying?" "Everything stays until there's a specific reason to change it," Nathan said. "If something isn't working, we identify it, we talk about why, and we change it together. Nothing gets changed unilaterally just because new ownership can change it. He looked at Cho directly. I want to sit down with you this week. You know the service operation better than anyone here. I need you to tell me what's working and what isn't. And I need you to know that telling me what isn't won't put your job at risk. Cho held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once and put his hand down. The meeting lasted 22 minutes. Nathan answered 6 questions, deferred 2 to Deborah, and at the end said simply that his door, the door to the office he hadn't yet sat in, was open to anyone who had concerns, and that he'd be on the floor for the first week rather than behind a desk. As people dispersed, a woman approached him, 50s, wearing a service advisor badge that said Linda K. She had the look of someone who'd been in the same building for a long time and had therefore developed opinions. I've been here 11 years, she said. I know, Nathan said. He'd read the employee files. You've been Service Advisor of the Year for the store 4 times. She looked slightly surprised that he knew that. I want you to understand that a lot of us aren't sure about this. About you. That's fair, Nathan said. Victoria wasn't perfect. She said it carefully. But she cared about this place. She came in on Saturdays. She knew our names. I know your name, Linda, Nathan said. I know everyone's name in this building. I don't know your daughter is in college at Ohio State and that you take her older brother's dog on weekends because he works long hours and the dog needs the exercise. I know that from your personnel file because I read everyone before today. He looked at her steadily. I can't tell you in one morning that I care about this place the way she did. You'll have to watch that over time. But I'm not coming in here to strip it apart. I'm coming in here because it's a good business built by people who gave a damn about it, and I intend to keep it that way. Linda looked at him for a long moment. Okay, she said. She went back to the service desk. Deborah appeared at his elbow. Good answer. It was just true. That's why it was a good answer. The first week was exhausting in the specific way that new responsibility was exhausting. Not physically, but in the cognitive weight of it. The constant stream of things Nathan didn't know yet that needed to be learned. People whose working styles needed to be understood. Systems he'd been told about in documents that looked different in practice. He stayed late 4 of the 5 days. He did sit-downs with Cho and with the sales manager, a careful man named Pete Galloway who had been at the store for 7 years and who took 3 days to decide Nathan was serious before he started speaking in complete sentences rather than guarded half answers. He also made 2 mistakes in that first week, which he had promised himself he would acknowledge cleanly when they happened. The first was a pricing decision on the used lot that Deborah told him, politely but clearly, was below what the market would bear and would set a precedent he didn't want. Nathan reversed it the next morning and told Deborah she'd been right. The second was a miscommunication with a vendor over a parts order that created a backlog in service for half a day. Nathan called the vendor himself to sort it out, which was not what owners typically did, and which the vendor found strange enough that it ended up resolving the issue faster than a formal complaint would have. He told no one he was living through an education. He didn't need to. The people who worked there were watching, because of course they were. And the picture that formed over those first weeks was one Nathan hadn't architected so much as lived. A man who came in early, knew what he didn't know, did what he said he'd do, and treated people like their work mattered. That picture was, he understood, the only actual credential that counted. Not the money, not the ownership papers, not the legal history of how he'd gotten here. What counted was what people saw when they watched him handle Tuesday's problem and Thursday's problem and the problem on Friday afternoon that nobody had anticipated. Character only revealed itself in accumulated small decisions. Nathan had believed that since he was 20 years old and nothing in the intervening years had changed his mind. Victoria called on the 14th day of operations. Nathan was in his office. He'd finally started using it, because Deborah had pointed out that being on the floor constantly was good for the first week but started to look like supervision anxiety after that. He picked up and she said, "How's the service revenue tracking?" "Up 3% against last November," Nathan said. "Though that's weather-related partly. Cold snap brought in a lot of deferred maintenance. Check your tire sensor inventory before December ends. I always ran low because demand spiked in the cold, and I never ordered enough in October." Nathan reached for a pen. "What did you order?" She gave him a number. He wrote it down. "I'll talk to Cho." "How's Linda doing?" "Good. She's still deciding about me. Give her until February, Victoria said. She's cautious, but she's fair. If you're still doing what you're doing now by February, she'll be the loudest person in the building on your behalf. That's useful to know. A brief pause. The consulting arrangement, I want to be clear that I'm doing this because I said I would, and because the people in that building deserve a clean transition, not because... She stopped. Not because we're friends, Nathan said. Right. I know, he said. I'm not asking for anything other than what we agreed. Another pause. You're doing all right, she said. It cost her something to say it, he could tell. Not because she was reluctant to be fair, but because being fair to the person who now owned what you'd built required a kind of maturity that was still relatively new to her. You built something worth doing all right in, Nathan said. She said nothing for a moment, then, the tire sensors. Don't wait on it. She hung up. Nathan looked at the number he'd written down, circled it, and went to find Cho. The month of January was when the real work settled into rhythm. Not the crisis management of early days, not the careful performance of first impressions, but the day-to-day work of running a business that served people and needed to do so consistently and well. There were problems. A technician who was good but had a pattern of cutting corners on documentation that Deborah addressed in a direct conversation Nathan wasn't present for. A financing vendor whose rates had crept up and needed to be renegotiated, which Pete Galloway handled with more skill than Nathan had expected. A burst pipe in the body shop on a Thursday night that cost $11,000 and 2 days of lost service capacity, and which Nathan stood in the middle of at 10 p.m. in his work clothes helping move equipment, which Linda told 3 different people about in the following week. He was learning the business the way he'd always learned things, by doing the work, accepting corrections, not flinching from the parts that were harder than anticipated. He talked to Deborah every morning before the day started and every Friday afternoon at the end of it. He called Frank Galliano once a week. He called Sylvia once to tell her the eminent domain case withdrawal had been formalized in the county record, and to thank her, and she accepted the thanks briefly and asked if he was eating enough protein, which was her way of saying she was glad it had worked out. He kept working at Decker's on Tuesdays and Thursdays. This was the thing that people found hardest to understand, that the owner of the former Sinclair flagship kept his shifts at a 4-bay shop on Maple Street. Roy had asked about it directly in January, in the parking lot, after Nathan's Thursday shift. You don't have to be here anymore, Roy said. I know. I'm not asking you to leave, I'm saying you don't have to. Nathan leaned against his truck. The lot was empty. The January air cold enough to make standing still uncomfortable. I like it here, he said. And I like working on cars without the business part attached to it. It's separate. It stays clean. Roy looked at him. That actually makes sense to me. Also, Nathan said, you still owe me a raise from 2 years ago. Roy pointed at him. I was hoping you'd forgotten that. I don't forget things, Roy. No, Roy said. You really don't. In the 3rd week of January, Lily came to the dealership for the first time. Nathan had been putting it off. Not intentionally, but there hadn't been a right moment, and he'd wanted the place to be stable enough that when she saw it, she was seeing it as it was going to be rather than what it was still becoming. Deborah had suggested the Saturday before the end of the month, when the floor was typically quieter and Nathan would have more time. He picked Lily up from her friend Priya's house. The library spot dispute had apparently been resolved. They were close friends now, which was a human development that Nathan found both predictable and instructive, and drove north toward the dealership. Lily had been told about the acquisition in pieces over the previous weeks. She understood the broad shape of it. Her father had bought the business belonging to the woman who'd left the cars in the driveway. She'd processed this with the specific practicality of a child who had watched her father work toward something for months, and now saw it resolved, and her primary question, which she'd asked twice, was whether the cars in the dealership were also ones he had fixed. No, Nathan had told her. These are new cars, well, new and used, different from restoration. So you didn't fix them? Not personally, but the people who work there fix them when they need it. She had thought about this. That's still kind of fixing things, she'd said finally. He'd agreed that it was. When they pulled into the lot, Lily pressed her face against the passenger window. Nathan parked, and they got out, and she stood in the lot and looked up at the building. It's big, she said. 12 acres. What's an acre? Bigger than our yard, smaller than a farm. She looked around. Where's the part you fixed? I haven't fixed anything yet. I just own it. She turned to look at him. But you will. Yes, he said. I will. She took his hand, which she still did occasionally in public, and which he valued precisely because he knew the years when she'd do it without thinking were numbered. They walked through the front entrance and into the showroom. Deborah met them at the door. She looked at Lily with the particular expression of adults who didn't have children but respected them. Genuine attention rather than performed enthusiasm. You must be Lily. Yes, Lily said. She looked at Deborah with the structural integrity look. You run this place. I do, Deborah said. With your dad. He's better with individual cars, Lily said seriously, but I think he can learn the big stuff. Deborah looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at the ceiling briefly. She's not wrong, Deborah said. They walked the floor. Lily asked questions about 6 different vehicles, reasonable questions, about engines and fuel economy and why certain models cost more than others, and Nathan answered them, and Deborah answered 2 she didn't know, and Linda, who was at the service desk and who had developed by this point a careful and growing respect for Nathan that she hadn't yet verbalized to him directly, watched from across the showroom with an expression that was difficult to read but not unfriendly. They went into the service corridor and Lily looked at the 8 bays with the same attentiveness she'd given the dinosaur hall at the Natural History Museum. Nathan could see her calibrating it against what she knew, his garage on Alderman Street, Decker's Auto where she'd been twice, and finding it larger and more complex, but not, fundamentally, a different kind of place. The same work happens here, she said. More or less, Nathan said, just with more people. Yes, she nodded. She understood this. She was 7 years old and she understood this the way she understood fractions once Nathan had connected them to measuring oil. The abstract made real by the concrete thing you'd already touched. They left an hour later. In the truck driving back south toward Alderman Street, Lily was quiet for a while. Nathan drove and let the quiet be. Dad, she said, after they'd been on the road for 10 minutes. Yeah. Are you happy? He thought about it honestly, which was the only way to think about it when Lily asked a direct question. He thought about the legal pad on the kitchen table, now filled and replaced by a new one. He thought about Roy pointing at him in the parking lot about the raise. He thought about Deborah's 3 pages of notes, and Cho's wary nod at the staff meeting, and Linda's 11 years and what it meant that she was watching. He thought about Victoria saying, take care of it, and him saying, I will. He thought about the tire swing in the backyard turning in the cold. He thought about Lily's shoebox of rocks under her bed. He thought about what she'd said in the garage, leaning against his arm. Okay, I'm going to bed now. And how that small sideways moment of trust was more than most of what he'd accomplished in the previous 3 months. Yeah, he said. I'm happy. She leaned her head against the window and watched the Ohio winter pass. Good, she said simply. He drove. The Camaro came out of the garage for the first time in late January, on a Saturday when the temperature had climbed enough to make driving it reasonable, which in Ohio in January meant 43 degrees and no active precipitation, which was what passed for acceptable. Nathan backed it out of the garage and let it idle in the driveway for 4 minutes, while the engine settled into its temperature and he listened to it run. It ran right. It had always had good bones, but now it ran with the particular smoothness that a properly rebuilt engine in a properly restored chassis produced. Not silent, nothing about a 1967 small block was silent, but steady and unhurried and correct. He took it up Route 9 and then north on a county road he knew well, away from town, where the road opened up and he could feel what it wanted to do. What it wanted to do was move. He let it, briefly, in a long, straight stretch, with visibility in both directions. And the car did what cars from this era did when they had been brought back to what they actually were. It pulled, cleanly and with intent, and for about 15 seconds, Nathan was simply driving without anything else attached to it. No legal pads, no board meetings, no transition plans, no history of the previous 4 months. Just road and speed and fathom green paint going north through a gray Ohio morning. Then he slowed down and drove back. He pulled into the driveway on Alderman Street and sat in the car for a moment with the engine running. He thought about the morning the tow trucks came. The sound of chains, the cold concrete under his socked feet, Carol Bassett's phone raised across the street. 12 vehicles in his driveway and a compliance notice, and the grinding start of 4 months that had changed the shape of his life in ways he hadn't asked for and wouldn't give back. There was a version of this story, Nathan knew, that was about revenge, about a man who was wronged and fought back and won. People would tell it that way. Some of them were already telling it that way. Roy had mentioned that the Calverton Facebook group had posted about the acquisition, and the same people who'd written "Billionaires don't play games, you can win" had done a specific kind of digital gymnastics to frame their new position. But that wasn't what the story was. Nathan had been clear about this in his own mind for long enough that it was settled. He hadn't wanted to defeat Victoria Sinclair. He hadn't engineered her downfall. He had protected his house, done the work that was in front of him, made the choices that kept his daughter's world intact, and arrived, not smoothly, not without cost, not without mistakes, at a place that was better than where he'd started. The difference mattered, not because it made a better story, but because the intent with which you did things shaped what you became. A man who spent 4 months engineering revenge was a different person at the end of 4 months than a man who spent them building something. Nathan was very clear about which one he wanted to be. He turned off the engine. The neighborhood was quiet. Carol Bassett's house was across the street, curtains closed. Herb Makowicz's car was in the driveway next door. The tire swing in the backyard was visible from the driveway if you knew to look for it, hanging still in the cold air. Nathan got out of the Camaro and went inside. Lily was at the kitchen table with a book. Not a homework book, a research book, the kind she sought out herself. It was about early American automotive history, which Nathan noted with quiet amusement she had apparently checked out from the school library, and she was reading it with the focused attention of someone who had decided to understand something properly. She looked up. "How was it?" "Good," he said. "How fast did you go?" "Not very." She gave him the look. "Dad." "Fast enough," he said. She went back to her book. He made 2 cups of hot chocolate, one for him, one for her, the real kind that took 10 minutes and used actual cocoa powder, which he'd started doing on weekend mornings because it was the kind of small thing that didn't cost much and mattered more than its size. He set hers next to her book without interrupting what she was reading. He sat across from her. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the backyard was gray and cold, the tire swing still, the oak tree standing in its winter shape without leaves. "Dad," Lily said, without looking up from the book. "Yeah." "Did you know that Henry Ford didn't invent the car? He invented the way to make lots of cars." "I knew that. Most people don't know that." She turned a page. "They think inventing the thing and figuring out how to make it work for everyone are the same thing. But they're not." Nathan wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at his daughter reading her book on a Saturday morning in the warm kitchen of the house he'd refused to sell. "No," he said, "they're not the same thing at all." She nodded, unsurprised that he agreed, and kept reading. There was one more thing, and it happened in February. Nathan received a call from Harlan Cross, the dealer in Pittsburgh who had sold the boss 429, who called twice a year anyway to stay in contact and occasionally drop a car Nathan's way when something unusual came through his network. But this call was different. "I've got something in my barn," Harlan said, "that I think you need to see." "What is it?" "A 1969 Mustang Mach 1, not a boss, but original R-code 428 Cobra Jet, numbers matching, stored in a temperature-controlled barn since 1984. Owner died last year and the estate is looking to sell." Nathan was quiet for a moment. A Mach 1 with a numbers-matching 428 Cobra Jet was not a Boss 429, but it was its own kind of significant. It was a car that had been built to go fast and had survived 40 years in storage because someone had cared enough to keep it out of the weather. It was, depending on condition, worth somewhere between $90,000 and $150,000 in the current market. It was also a Mustang, and Nathan had promised his daughter a Mustang. "Send me the photos," he said. The photos arrived that evening. Nathan looked at them at the kitchen table after Lily was in bed. The car was Wimbledon white, original paint, remarkably preserved, with the specific chalky oxidation of paint that had been out of sunlight for decades, which could be corrected with polish and time. The engine bay showed its age but was intact. The interior needed work. It was not perfect. Nothing was ever perfect coming out of storage after 40 years. But it was real, and it was honest, and Nathan could see in the particular way he always saw things what it was underneath what it currently appeared to be. He called Harlan back. "What's the estate asking?" Harlan told him. It was fair, not a bargain, but fair. "I'll come next weekend," Nathan said. He drove to Pittsburgh on a Saturday in February, leaving Lily with Herb Makowicz, who had become, over the preceding months, something close to the grandfather figure that Nathan's own father had never quite been, and who watched Lily with the patient attention of a man who took seriously any responsibility entrusted to him. The barn was 40 minutes outside Pittsburgh, on a property that had once been a working farm and now looked after itself in the way rural land looked after itself when the people who worked it were gone. The car was in the far bay of a 3-bay barn, separated from 2 decades of accumulated farming equipment by a plywood partition that had been built specifically to protect it. Nathan stood in front of it for about 5 minutes without touching it. Then he crouched to the driver's side and looked at the rocker panel. Then he looked at the engine bay. Then he opened the driver's door. It moved stiffly, the hinges complaining from years of stillness, and sat in the driver's seat. He sat there in the cold barn, with the smell of old vinyl and dust and the particular specific smell that old American muscle cars had that Nathan could not describe to anyone who hadn't spent time around them. Something between oil and history and cold metal. And he thought about a 7-year-old girl who collected smooth river rocks and named prehistoric marine animals, and read books about automotive history because she'd decided it was worth understanding. He thought about a promise he'd made in a garage on a cold night, sitting next to a Fathom green Camaro. He got out of the car and found the estate attorney who'd come out to oversee the viewing. "I'll take it," Nathan said. He had the Mach 1 transported back to Calverton on a flatbed. Not enclosed, because it wasn't ready for that yet. And because Nathan had always believed that a car in the middle of becoming what it was supposed to be shouldn't be hidden, he had it delivered to the garage on Alderman Street on a Sunday afternoon. Lily was at the kitchen window when it arrived. He heard her run outside and he followed. She stood in the driveway and looked at it on the trailer. It was not, in its current state, impressive. The chalky white paint was mottled and dull. The chrome was pitted. One of the quarter-glass windows had a crack. It sat on the trailer with the specific imperfection of a thing that had been waiting a long time for someone to decide it was worth something. "Is this it?" Lily said. "Not yet," Nathan said. "It will be." She walked around the trailer, looking at it from every angle, the way she circled things she was serious about, the way she'd circled the T-Rex display case at the Natural History Museum. She was quiet while she did it, and Nathan let her be. She stopped at the front of the car and looked at it for a long moment. "What color is it going to be?" she asked. "That's up to you," Nathan said. She looked at him sharply. "Really? It's your car," he said. "Eventually. So yes, that's up to you." She looked at the car again, thought about it with the focused seriousness she brought to everything she decided was worth deciding carefully. "I need to think about it," she said. "Take your time," Nathan said. "We're not in a hurry." She looked at the car one more time, and then she looked at her father, and the expression on her face was the one he valued most of all. The expressions he'd seen from her. Not the structural integrity look, not the research focus, but the specific, unguarded look that meant she was somewhere between happy and something larger than happy that she didn't yet have a word for. "Okay," she said. Then she went back inside because she had a book she was in the middle of, which was the most Lily thing she could have done. Nathan stood in the driveway with the car on the trailer and the February cold and the gray Ohio sky and the tire swing visible over the roofline of the house, turning slightly in the wind. He stood there for a while. The truth about what had happened over the past 4 months was not a story about winning. Nathan had turned this over enough times to be sure of that. It wasn't about justice exactly either. Justice implied a system that had balanced itself, and systems didn't do that cleanly or reliably. What had happened was something smaller and more human. A man who saw things other people missed had been put under pressure that was meant to break him, and instead of breaking, he had done the work that was in front of him, one car at a time, one decision at a time, without losing track of what he was actually working toward. He hadn't been fearless. He'd been afraid, some nights, in the specific way that single parents who carry everything alone are afraid, not of failure for themselves, but of what failure would mean for the small person in the next room, counting on them to hold the whole thing together. The fear hadn't gone anywhere. It had just stopped being the thing that made his decisions. He hadn't been certain. He'd made choices that could have gone differently, and he knew that. The Mustang could have been a different car. Sylvia could have lost the legal challenge. Victoria could have escalated rather than withdrawn. Nathan had been careful, and he had been skilled, and he had also been, at several points, fortunate. And he was honest enough about that not to dress it up as something purer. And Victoria, he thought about her, standing in the cold Emmett's parking lot adjusting her coat before she got in the Audi, having just signed documents that transferred her father's first dealership to someone she'd tried to ruin 6 months earlier. There was no clean story there, nothing that resolved into a lesson with edges. She had made choices that were wrong. She had also, when it came to it, made choices that required real courage, calling him instead of escalating, withdrawing the designation, walking into Emmett's without a script. Nathan didn't know what her life looked like now, restructuring her development financing and running her remaining 11 dealerships and working with the wound of what she'd lost. He thought about her sometimes with something that wasn't sympathy and wasn't indifference, something in between that didn't have a word for it. He hoped she was building something she could be proud of. He meant that without irony. The car was unloaded from the trailer by a driver Nathan paid and thanked by name, a habit he'd had for years that he'd never thought of as anything except basic courtesy. He rolled it into the garage and covered it with a canvas tarp and closed the door. That evening, after dinner, Lily came into the garage while he was checking on it. She lifted a corner of the tarp and looked at the car. "I think I know the color," she said. "Yeah? Velocity blue," she said, "like really deep blue. Almost like it's moving when it's standing still." Nathan looked at her. "That's a real color. It's a Dodge color originally, but we can match it." "I know," she said, with the serenity of someone who had done their research. "I looked it up." He looked at the covered car. Velocity blue on a 69 Mach 1 with white stripes, which it had originally been optioned with, which Lily didn't know yet, but which Nathan could already see in his mind clearly and completely. "That's a good choice," he said. She put the corner of the tarp back down carefully, patting it in the way she patted things she wanted to take care of. Then she looked at her father. "How long will it take?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. The work that needed doing, the time he had available, the patience that a proper restoration required against the impatience that was also part of doing it right. "About a year," he said. "Maybe a little more." She nodded. "That's okay," she said. "Good things take time." She went back inside. Nathan stood in the garage alone with the covered car and the smell of primer and oil and the particular cold of a February night coming under the door. He had a business to run in the morning and 2 shifts at Decker's this week and a conversation with Pete Galloway about the spring sales structure and a call with Frank Galliano on Thursday and a homework situation with Lily that was about long division and was probably going to require the same approach as fractions, connecting it to something real before the abstract made sense. He had a year of evenings ahead of him working on a Mustang for his daughter, which was the kind of thing that couldn't be rushed and couldn't be shortcut, and which would be done when it was done and not before. He turned off the garage light. He went inside, where the kitchen was warm, and Lily's homework was spread across the table, and the shoebox of rocks was under her bed, and the legal pads were stacked in the corner with 4 months of decisions written in angular handwriting across their pages, and the house was full of the particular quiet of a life that had been protected and was still standing. He made 2 cups of hot chocolate. He sat down at the table and waited for his daughter to come find him.